Welcome to everybody. This first Zoom conference of the Research and Policy Network on Conflict of CEPR. We had already an in-person conference in Geneva a bit some months back, and so now we have this Zoom conference. Great that you could make it. I just wanted to say a few words of thanks for CEPR, who has always been super supportive of this network, and also ERC, Swiss National Fund, University of Lausanne, etc., various institutions that have helped us with activities. Okay, so conference will be today for the next 4 hours, and then tomorrow as well. So great to have you on board. I give the word immediately to Joachim.
So this is joint work with Bruno Capretini and Alex True, and we'll be talking about fighting for growth, labor scarcity, and technology adoption during the British Industrial Revolution. So we have one quote that summarizes the entire paper, and it's a quote from more than 200 years ago. So let me just read it for you. And it says, this is from the general view of the agriculture of Dorset. So the British government actually compiled these surveys of what agriculture is like in different counties, and did it basically every decade. And they say in the section 5 about threshing machines and winnowing machines, a considerable number of threshing machines have been erected in this county, and nearly all of them within the present century, so since 1800. The principal inducement for using them is a scarcity of laborers, which in a state of warfare may be expected to be felt most in the maritime districts. Okay, so there you have everything that we want to show you and argue. We're going to look at technology adoption, not invention, and we're going to try to argue that a labor scarcity induced by the Napoleonic Wars is crucial for one of the main ways in which labor-saving technology enters the British economy in the 19th century, which is in agriculture in the form of threshing machines. And because it's geographically disaggregated, we have variation in the cross-section across England. We're going to show you, first of all, exactly how this works. And we have an identification strategy that we're very excited about. So why is this interesting? Well, you know, everybody cares about directed technological change and how much change you get as a response to factor scarcity. So there's the important work by Daron, and more recently Daron and Pascal Restrepo. It also matters because it's the British Industrial Revolution, and there's like two main interpretations for why Britain goes first. So there's one by Bob Allen, which sounds very closely related, but has some interesting conceptual challenges. It says essentially, Britain industrializes first because labor is so expensive and coal is so cheap. And then the technology comes along to basically resolve this difficulty that comes from one being too dear and the other one too cheap. And that's why the Industrial Revolution is initially British. The alternative view is one associated with the name of Joel Mokyr, that emphasizes the quality of the workforce, differences in culture, a sequence of micro-invention that just keeps improving things. So the importance of tinkerers and savants that basically get Britain going. And what we're gonna, there's all sorts of issues with this. This whole literature has a certain, shall we say, empirical challenge because the number of observations is structurally low. People compare Britain with France, with Holland, with China. And what are you gonna do with a cross-section of n equals 4? Okay, so what we want to do is to basically say both of these things matter in a very particular way, and we can take it to the cross-section in England using early 19th century data. Okay, so I'm going to show you how different types of agricultural machinery get adopted as a function of labor market conditions within England. Okay, so that's what we're going to show you. Labor scarcity leads to the adoption of labor-saving machines. We will have a placebo. We collect lots of data on machines that don't save labor and show you that here the same thing is not happening. Okay, and the labor scarcity, we're going to argue, comes from military recruitment. We will also show you how this leads to better machines. So in our setting, at least, adoption is technological progress, not just because it increases productivity, but it makes the machinery itself better. And it will lead to structural change, enhancing the productivity of the whole economy. So how we're going to do that, we collect data in the following forms. We're going to have data from who gets recruited into the British military. We'll show you how much of a difference it makes at the local level in terms of the labor force. We're looking at sex ratios. We'll use data on technology adoption from newspapers. And then we have these competitions for who has the best machine that the Royal Agricultural Society organizes. And we have all the entrants there. We can show you how much better the machinery gets as a function of adoption. And then we'll use the census to track structural change. Okay, so let's skip this. So the wars against France take a quarter of a century, and they're really big in terms of manpower usage. So this is on the same scale as World War I, World War II almost. So Britain at the time has maybe 10 million people, a little bit less. Half of them are male, prime-aged males, maybe 2.6 million. And at its peak, the British Armed Forces have 360,000 people under arms from almost nothing immediately before the outbreak of war. Not everybody is British who serves in the British Armed Forces, but a very large number of them do. So a reasonable guess is that something like 10% of the male labor force is suddenly sucked into the military. Okay, so then we're going to focus on the Royal Navy. And we're going to focus on the Royal Navy, A, because it's going to give us a beautiful identification strategy, but also because it's the kind of people that we're interested in. So the British Army is composed of people who, you know, in modern parlance, we would not classify as high human capital, or as somebody who really knew his soldiers. The Duke of Wellington said they're the scum of the earth, the mere scum of the earth, meaning they're people that would normally not hold a normal job, but they'd be vagrants and beggars and criminals, okay? So that's why we're going to focus on the Royal Navy. And we have digitized muster rolls. So these are basically sort of manpower lists that the Royal Navy compiles. This is for His Majesty's ship Caledonia. And then we know for each person on board their name, their age, but also the place and county where they're born. And this we digitize. So we have 261 ships muster rolls out of a total of 950 ships in the Royal Navy. Some of this was given to us kindly by historians who collected some of it, Ross Dancy. The British National Archive had already digitized the men on the ships at Trafalgar. And to this, we added 94 to get a balanced sample of manpower usage in the British Navy. Okay, so this is where people come from. Every black dot, every black circle is recruits. The bigger the circle, the more people have been recruited. So you can see they come from all over. Every red dot is a Navy station, a Royal Navy port or anchorage. So then we collect data on agricultural machines, and we take this from these general views of agriculture that I already told you about, but also from advertisements where the machines are for sale, or farms are for sale or for lease containing these machines. And we read a lot of really exciting agricultural history to classify them into labor-saving and non-labor saving machinery. So the main labor-saving thing is threshing, which just involving separating grain from chaff, and then there's a bunch of others. So you know all what threshing is. You can do it mechanically with a flail, or you can do it with a machine, and the machines are much better, meaning they have much higher productivity, about a factor 8 or so compared to the flail if you do it water powered. Okay, so this is where our data comes from. These are these ads. So in total, we have collected data on about 3,400 machines or so, more labor saving than non-labor saving, and then within labor saving, it's dominated by threshing machines, but we have others too. Okay, so this is where they are. This is where they're being adopted. Again, every dot is a parish that has at least one of them. Okay, so let me just show you some very basic correlations. First thing we do is to show you that the recruitment that we track goes hand in hand with imbalances in the sex ratio, meaning here positive number means too many women compared to the number of men. So where you recruit more, there's more women than men, or suggestive of men missing. Works out statistically. So then does this do something for the adoption of labor-saving machines? Well, here's the reduced form, if you will, as well as the sort of final step, OLS. So if you just use sex ratios to explain machinery adoption, that works. This is a bin scatter, so we have 10,000 observations, otherwise you couldn't see anything. But it's satisfyingly upward sloping, more machines as the sex ratio becomes more unbalanced. And the same works if you use recruits directly. So log recruits as an explanatory variable seems to correlate positively and strongly with the adoption of machinery, just as contemporaries said. Okay, this is for non-labor saving machines using the same scale. Okay, so if you sort of flip back and forth, you can see there's maybe on the left-hand side a slight upward sloping pattern. It's not very clear. It's not statistically significant. On the right-hand side, you basically have nothing. Okay, so we don't have to be invested in finding nothing. It just has to be smaller, and we think it is in a satisfying way. So here's the same thing with numbers. You have the strong significant coefficients for labor-saving machinery adoption, and then no significant effects for the non-labor-saving machinery. So how big is this? How many extra machines does this actually generate? So if we actually take this, we get for an average log number of recruits, an extra 0.02 machines. So what we measure is 0.25 machines. So it's about 10% of adoption that that seems to affect directly. But of course, it's probably a huge underestimate given how shoddy our data is. Okay. There's some evidence that this adopting stuff makes the machines better. So this is the kind of data that we have, these experiments that they run to see how good the machines are that do the threshing. And the here you have all the different entrants. You have who's the owner. Sometimes you have local noblemen like the Duke of Norfolk entering a machine, and then they're being examined, and they actually publish just how productive these machines are. Okay, so this is how they evolve over time. There's a change in the way the threshing is being done, from the sort of straightforward threshing plus threshing combined with the separating of chaff from grain. So as you can see, over time this increases, but importantly, the more threshing machines you have, the more people compete in your local area Royal Agricultural Society competition, and the higher the productivity is of these machines that people enter. So you have a sort of standard learning by doing story where the tinkering is a result of adoption, and that tinkering makes the machines better to a significant extent. Okay, so how big is this in terms of structural change? Well, here's two outcomes, so the same outcome measured in two different ways. If you look at the share of people in agriculture relative to the total workforce, we compare the censuses, then where you have more adoption of labor-saving agricultural machinery, the share of people in agriculture goes down, as you would expect, and the total number of people in agriculture is also going down, and quite rapidly. Okay, so how big is this? Well, let me just go here. I can explain this in detail, but in the interest of time, I think I'll skip it. Our best estimate is that it saves about 72,000 agricultural workers, or throws 72,000 agricultural workers out of a job. Okay, that's just the extra adoption of machinery as a result of military recruitment. Okay, so let's talk about identification, because it's clearly the heart and core of the paper. Why should we believe that any of this stuff is causal? There could be a million other things going on. So here's our instrumentation strategy illustrated with a contemporary print. The British Navy had two particular features. One is that they didn't have a central HR office. They didn't staff the Navy through a centralized structured process. Instead, every captain was in charge of doing the recruitment himself. So He would choose lieutenants, but then how to man the ship, and a large ship of the line would have up to 950 men, was up to them. And one thing that helped them was the impressment service. So this was mostly done just by the ship's crew themselves. They also had a centralized service called the impressment service that would roam across England and look for happy candidates who you now see, you can see being inducted into the Navy against their own will. There's many happy stories of people being knocked over the head and waking up aboard a Royal Navy ship and not seeing the shore again for another 5 years or so. Okay. So how many of these are actually recruited in this way? Well, in the muster rolls, we actually have data on the share of non-volunteers. And it's about half. Half of the people on these ships are for sure pressed against their will. And of the rest, many of them are only signing up as volunteers because they know that they can be forcibly recruited. So it's probably much more than half, but half is for sure. Okay. So now in terms of sort of aggregate impact on manpower available, you could think maybe they just grab people from the merchant marine, then, you know, there isn't much pressure on the sort of availability of labor on the land. But that's not true. The foreign and coastal shipping, the merchant marine, non-military actually expands in absolute numbers at the same time as the Royal Navy expands. So there's little substitution in the aggregate. These people have to come from somewhere and they grab them from inland. Okay. So yeah, let's just get back here. What is this? Okay. So how do we make this useful for figuring out identification? We're going to use the profile of the seabed around the British Isles. The reason why we do that, you see in this image, this is HMS Victory, the ship commanded by Nelson during the Battle of Trafalgar. These are the biggest ships floating anywhere, so much bigger than civilian ships. They also cost 5 or 6 times what a steel mill costs, each one of them. And the crucial thing is that they have a greater draft, meaning they need more water under the keel than commercial ships do, which means that they are not equally, they don't have the same ease of accessing land as other ships would. So what we have here is basically contour lines for depth of the seabed in front of England. And we calculate distance to the deep sea. Distance to the deep sea meaning how far away is the seabed that has at least 15 meters depth, where 15 meters is what you roughly need to make sure that something like HMS Victory doesn't run aground, okay? And you can see that, you can already by eyeballing see that the naval stations are pretty much everywhere where the seabed is relatively close, which makes a lot of sense. If you want to load and unload, if you want to send people ashore, you need to be relatively close to the coastline. So then we just validate this. You know, the Royal Navy ports are where the distance to deep sea measured as at least 15 meters depth is very close by. For the commercial ports, we don't find that. There's a negative coefficient, it's not significant, it's much smaller. Okay, so then we do the same thing for different cutoffs. And as you can see, it doesn't work for 5 meters, it doesn't work for 10 meters, it doesn't work for 20, it only works for 15. It only works for the specific depth, for the specific type of ships, where the vast majority of manpower demand of the Royal Navy is actually in question. Okay, so what do we do with this? So then we say, let's just take only the coastal parishes. So we're going to forget about the fact that some places are very far inland and others not. And we'll just take literally what the general view of agriculture told us, that it's the maritime districts that are most affected by this. So we throw away 80% of our data, or 75%, we keep 2,300 parishes. And within these, they all have coastal access, they can all easily ship stuff in commercial ships. Some of them are easily accessible to the Royal Navy, meaning they can send in boats, they can find your local tavern, they can go and grab your men, okay? And that's what we use to explain labor scarcity and then technology adoption. Okay, that's our IV strategy. And what you have to believe for that to make sense is to say that the only reason why you might have people missing or more recruits is that here the Royal Navy can come ashore and impress your people, but there's no other reason why the men might be absent. Okay, and this is what you see here. This actually works, and it works very well, we think. It's hugely correlated with labor scarcity, both in form of recruitment directly and in terms of unbalanced labor sex ratios. It predicts the adoption of labor-saving technology, but it doesn't predict the adoption of non-labor saving technology to any significant extent. So I'm not going to bore you with robustness. Just trust me, it's awesome. It's awesome in terms of robustness. So what have we shown you? We studied British agriculture in 1800, not because we're that excited about agriculture in England as such, but we want to investigate factor-biased technological change. And what we see is that, first of all, technology adoption is driven by labor scarcity. And we measure scarcity directly. We're not looking at wages or anything like that, but it's physical quantities. It's men not being where they previously were, or where the number of women suggests they ought to be. And then we show how this adoption subsequently actually influences technological progress. So what this seems to suggest is that Allen and Moke can both be right. Factor scarcity matters for the Industrial Revolution, but it partly matters because it helps technology adoption to have these high factor prices, which then leads to further technological progress and actually helps to accelerate productivity change. It also offers insights into the role of wars in terms of making technological change happen. So once the war's over, of course, you might be forgiven for thinking everything should go into reverse. You might think that now everything should be as it was before. But first of all, it's a fixed cost investment. So once you've made it, you're not going to undo things and go back to a labor intensive process. But it's also that machines keep getting better. So once you adopt them, it becomes ever harder to go back to the state of nature before. Okay, so that's what we have, and I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joachim. This was great. You're ahead of time. So I don't know whether it's my job now to try to steer the discussion, but I think it's fine if people just ask questions. I can also amplify my screen if you want to, but I think it's, unless it goes completely overboard, I'm happy to just to go forward and ask questions.
So I'm just, this is Chris. I think it's super interesting. I mean, I'm kind of interested in this idea in the role of wars, and I maybe there's an obvious answer, which is the rest of Europe doesn't enjoy this technological change because they're busy being blown up, and but that's actually not true for many parts of the continent. It's true for many, of course. So do you have a sense that this is also going on elsewhere, and it's unmeasured because maybe we don't have the identification or the same data, or this is really limited to Britain because it's like particular moment?
I think it's mostly limited to Britain, and for a very good reason. So, Chris is really asking, the Napoleonic Wars are not called Napoleonic for nothing. Other people fight in them too, and especially the French army, but also the Germans, the Spanish, and so forth, send a lot of young men to war, including lots of them that don't come back. So why wouldn't the same kind of shock have the same effect elsewhere? That's sort of the spirit of Chris' question as I interpret it. And the reason why it doesn't happen elsewhere, I think, has to do with British starting conditions, which I think is very interesting. Britain is the only country that has a highly commercialized, highly productive agriculture. So elsewhere, you have a lot of peasant agriculture. It's super unproductive. It's like the Lewis model. There's like 3 people when you need 1. And that partly has to do just with ownership structure, family farms, and so forth. Britain basically already has a very tight labor market where, you sort of marginal cost equals marginal revenue considerations are determining hiring, because all of these farms are commercial operations. They sell to the market, they hire people temporarily, and if they don't pay their own way, they fire. Okay, so if the system's already stretched tight, and now you have a very big sudden shock to the availability of labor, you will go and have to look elsewhere to get the job done. And technology is one way to do it. You just reduce the amount of labor you need to perform the same tasks. The threshing machine in particular has another attractive feature in this context, which is that you can use the work of women and children to a much greater extent, because the physical strength requirement of sort of banging the flail overhead for 8 to 10 hours a day, that's gone. So now the people who haven't gone to war, you can also use them to do your task. And in combination, I think this is exactly what's going on. You get this similar shock elsewhere. It doesn't have the same effect because you have this institutional feature that English agriculture is already incredibly productive to start.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Paul.
Thanks so much, Joachim, for the great presentation. So I was wondering, Stephen Redding has a similar paper in a similar setting, right, where they study labor movements in Britain after the repeal of the Corn Laws. And it's kind of super interesting that during your sample, you also have the Corn Laws present, basically keeping American grain out, which might, of course, I mean, it's a protectionist measure, so I'm not sure how the two papers interact, right? If they are so productive, then compared to everyone else, then they wouldn't need to protect themselves from American grain. Or do I miss something there? Or how does this interact?
So yeah, Britain has the Corn Laws, and they're not really sort of working as simple protection, but it's more like a smoothing mechanism. So they come in after the Napoleonic Wars, and it's basically a varying scale. So if you have a misharvest in England and grain prices are going to be very high, they let in a lot of corn from the continent. If England has a very abundant harvest, then they don't let anything in. So it's basically a sort of stabilization measure. And it is true that from 1850 onwards, as shipping technology improves, everybody in Europe has a problem because there's always American, but also Argentine, Australian grain and other food products coming in. And all of a sudden, all the agricultural sectors are uncompetitive. But that's at this stage still 50 years in the future, and it's a completely different ballgame. Okay.
So I have Giacomo and then Maria.
Yes, a couple of questions. The first is, do you also have any reaction on the extensive margin, saying changing what these people are doing with their land rather than with what machines? I presume there are more and less labor-intensive things that they can do, and that some reallocation would be useful. And the second, in terms of understanding how these helps us reconcile Allen and Morelli, I may have misread, but I thought you were saying that, you know, about 10% of the male labor force gets press ganged into the Navy, but then this labor saving mechanism saves them like 4 or 5%. So it's still a net loss of manpower. So I am not quite sure what I take that to mean as industrialization. That yes, you know, agriculture loses labor, therefore it adopts more technology, but it's still a net labor loss.
So, you know, all the quantifications here are extremely rough because, you know, we're pretty sure that we're missing a lot of machines. Why are we sure? Because there's an event in 1830 called the Swing Riots, where a lot of machines get attacked and broken. And then we can just check if we had them in our data, right? Because it's like a flash bulb going off saying, you know, here's where the machines are, somebody's breaking them. And we have, for every machine that gets broken, we have about 8 machines that get broken, we have about 1 in our data. So that actually suggests that, you know, the true effect is maybe orders of magnitude larger. Now, in terms of your question of, you know, I didn't catch your point about Morelli versus Allen, sorry.
No, sorry. That I was just asking, you know, do we think that the war actually has, you know, labor shedding effects for agriculture? Because I thought that the old-fashioned view was that, well, you know, you get manufacturing to take off. It's a structural transformation story because there's a surplus of labor from agriculture. But if mechanization is just a response to the fact that labor is disappearing, I don't see the labor shedding. So yeah, it's not a critique of the paper, but just understanding what I take this phenomenon to mean for the Industrial Revolution. I mean,
yeah, no, I think that's a very important point, because the textbook model of industrialization is that you have this totally backward agriculture, and then industrialization basically pulls people out of this backward sector, makes them much more productive, and that's where the productivity gains come from, and so forth. And in that context, it's very interesting that the British Industrial Revolution is so different. The agricultural sector has no productivity gap with the industrial sector as early as 1750 or so. Okay, so that's special, and we want to understand what that is. And in this context, then, it's not so much we think that industry is pulling people in, but that agriculture is pushing them out. Which then, of course, because you don't need to pay huge wage premium in the industrial centers and so forth, makes it easier to industrialize, because these people have just lost their job, their outside opportunities are nil, so you can basically get them for a song, and that's very good for profits, for capital formation, etc. Also leading, of course, to the conditions that Engels describes, and the conditions of the English working class.
Maria, go ahead.
Just a question, do you have data on trade in these different locations? I'm wondering, for example, you showed that these deep sea places, they were related to Royal Navy ports, but not to the presence of commercial ports. But I thought that maybe it's related, to not the extensive margin, but to the intensive margin, to the volume of trade. Maybe like with changing technology of commercial shipment, now these deep sea locations were becoming more attractive over time. And that partly explains the effect that you observed. That it's because of the demand from outside, there is incentive to industrialize.
Yeah, so that would be a threat to our identification strategy, right? So if other things were happening in these deep sea ports, basically. So it's not quite, we don't have good data for the volume of trade for each one of these locations. We have good aggregate statistics for England. We could look at where the really big ships go. So the biggest ships at the time are what they call the India Men. So these are the ships that sail to India and beyond. And we could just try to see if we separate those out, whether that makes a difference or whether that's an important part of our story. But they too don't need the depth of the Royal Navy harbors. Another alternative threat to identification would be that it's the demand from the Navy to victual all these ships and keep them afloat and repair them and so forth. That's actually part of what's creating the agricultural change here, because if you're close to a Navy port, maybe you're the best person to provide them with the grain that goes into the biscuits they bake and so forth. And that would be a very different story, because then you have you have lots of money in your pocket, and then some of it you invest in new machinery. And the best way to deal with that is to just basically get rid of the hinterland or the surrounding parishes close or relatively close to the Royal Navy stations, and really focus on the parts of the coastline that are not close to the Royal Navy stations and anchorages. And if you do that, it still works just as advertised.
Okay, I see no more hands. Marta, yeah.
Hey, thank you for the nice presentation. So one question is that I was wondering, here you talk about that we miss like 10% of the men were recruited. And so usually in this situation, they look for the incorporation of women in the labor market, and they substitute and they look for, so what happened here with women? So I understand all the mechanisms that you explained, but what is the role of women? So they are not, they don't have more incorporation to labor market. What's going on?
Yeah, great. So one of the reasons why this technology is so attractive is that you can use women to do the same task that previously men did. So threshing is one of these things that needs upper body strength, where some men have a comparative advantage. The machine can be operated by women and by boys. The other, this was an earlier question that I didn't answer fully. The other question was, what about changes in product mix? So the big alternative that just uses much less labor is pastoral farming, livestock farming. But you don't really switch from wheat to livestock farming simply because the geographical characteristics, the land characteristics that make this attractive are so strong, they're so important, that you're not going to change your product mix from arable to livestock. That would save a lot of labor. It might happen at the margin, but it's not going to be a big part of the story overall.
This is work that is together with Christopher Rao and Alessandro Ruggieri, and it's kind of like a long-standing project between me and Christopher, and I'm sure some of you will have seen parts of this, and I apologize to those. But we're now kind of I think really breaking ground on the theory side. And let me stress that I've been doing a lot of policy work, and it's a bit shocking that people need to take decisions all the time with regard to conflict prevention, and sometimes they can rely on us for evidence. But what I saw is that there's a big demand for the kind of framework that we want to develop here that is not yet developed, and I think it's kind of, for the policy side, it's very useful, and I really hope that you find this at least a little interesting and not too phenomenological. So we all know that civil wars are a serious humanitarian and economic problem, and we fail to prevent them because they keep breaking out. And so what I would like to kind of stress that it's not only a problem of understanding them well enough, right? Of course, apart from the political will being lacking and so on, it's on the academic side even, it's not only a problem of understanding the causes of conflict, because prevention is what Kleinberg and others call the prediction policy problem. So the effectiveness of prevention is basically the treatment effect that many of us have studied or are studying, right? So given a certain policy, how much less likely would conflict be, and the targeting, right? And of course, we now are all much more aware of this, because in epidemics, this is a really big thing, right? So how do you time a certain policy? How do you time a lockdown? This is one of the central questions, actually. Conflicts outbreaks only happen about after 4% of all country months, right? So if you would just target them randomly without trying to do any forecasting, even a very, very good large treatment effect would completely evaporate, and effectiveness would be terrible. So, what we do in this project is we develop an evaluation framework for prevention that kind of is a forecast based on machine learning, and many of you have seen this already. And then we try to feed this into a dynamic policy framework which brings together all the pieces. So first of all, conflict dynamics. Many of you have written and know about this very well, that conflict dynamics are a very, very important feature of what conflict is. Forecast precision, the cost of conflict and the treatment effect and the cost of prevention policies. And here, of course, I will for now assume numbers, but of course they can be modeled inside this framework. So if I would kind of give a big motivation on the kind of methodological side, I would say what we want to do is like bring machine learning together with the dynamic optimization that we as economists are more familiar with. And I'm going to do this now kind of in a one-way street. I'm going to go from machine learning, basically provide raw material for what I'm going to do in the dynamic optimization. But our hope is that kind of within the next few months, we will be able to kind of put the dynamic optimization and actually feed it to the machine learning and do a kind of a cycle where we optimize the method. I'm happy to talk about that in the end, but we're not there yet. I was very tempted to kind of present here because of the title of the conference, and so it's kind of really work in progress. And I would like to stress that this is really a general problem. So these kind of policy prevention problems are everywhere nowadays. So climate, crime, epidemics, I think they all fit to this, and the model we have now is really general enough to encompass many of this. And of course, I'm going to make very specific assumptions that fit to the conflict model, but I think it's more general than that. So literature, it's very nice to present a crowd like you, because obviously I can just say, like, you guys are my literature. But let me stress two examples. A paper by Massimo and others, kind of being very skeptical, I would say, towards mediation efforts, and then coming up with a kind of very specific way you would do this on the theory side, and a paper by Dominic and Matthias on kind of what they call the war trap. And I'm going to allude to this a lot in my work, and I think it's a very important feature. And if anything, then Dominic's work and Matthias' work is really reinforcing the message I want to send here. And I think there's a lot of complementarity between their overview and what I'm going to rely on. But kind of the main motivation for kind of the route we have been taken is this ER paper on prediction policy problems, which kind of stressed this aspect I stressed before, namely that prediction actually, even though mostly frowned upon, can be very useful if you're not sure where to target your treatments. And of course, there is actually a big literature on forecasting in political science, and recently in economics, and of course we are closely related to this. So let me structure this talk a little bit. I'm going to first talk about the conflict trap and what we see as the hard problem of prediction for prevention, and this is basically repeating messages from a previous paper of me and Christopher. Then I'm going to try to convince you that modeling this with a Markov chain is a very, very cool thing. Not only cool, but also very useful for when you want to bring this to kind of like a dynamic decision-making problem. And then I'm going to talk about the forecast method and the resulting risk data we get from the forecast method. And then I'm going to feed that into the Markov chain. And this will allow us to build then a policy framework of optimal dynamic prevention decisions that a decision maker could take, who knows that in the future he will also intervene, and so on and so forth. So like the full on, Alessandro, of course, is here, the main guy. It's amazing how much progress we made since he joined the team on this front. So let me first talk about the conflict trap. This is the likelihood that you have another outbreak of conflict, you coming out of conflict, right? So at 0, a previous war episode, a previous conflict episode ends. By the way, I'm defining conflict here with a very kind of like, do you have any violence according to UCDP? But I mean, it doesn't really matter at all how I define it here. This graph will look exactly the same, no matter how you define it, no matter how you draw this cutoff. So you come out of conflict at 0, and the likelihood that you have another outbreak next month is 40%. Of course, this will be like ceasefires and everything, right? Everything will be here. This is not really the end of a conflict. It's just a little pause, and then it starts again. But this risk does not end immediately. It actually goes on for quite some time, and it stays elevated for around 10 years before it kind of peters out into something that one would call kind of baseline risk, I would say. And if you're forecasting, you're fighting this thing, right? And this is really important. So this is going to give you like a really, really, really good forecast of risk. Like just throwing in a few variables that capture that you just had a conflict or you're just coming out of conflict is going to give you an amazing forecast of that this is a very high risk situation. And now let me kind of try to push this idea of like modeling this in a Markov chain. What I'm doing here is I'm structuring piece into 2 different pieces. One piece is the pre-piece, the pre-conflict piece. And this is if you didn't have any conflict before. And the other one is the post-piece. And this is arbitrary. These are 5 years after the last war episode. And what you see here, I hope you see my cursor. What you see here is that the pre-piece is incredibly persistent, right? So if you start a month in the pre-war peace, there is a 99.7% likelihood that you stay there, okay? And only a 0.26%, so it's very, very low risk that you actually go into conflict. Then conflict is very persistent. Once you're in conflict, you stay in conflict with a lot of high probability, and you move into the post-peace, right? You can't go back into the pre-peace, obviously, the way I've defined things. You go into the post-peace with some probability, and then the post-peace is also persistent, but it's not as persistent, actually. So this is the kind of, this curve that I showed you before is captured here by this 10%. These are the very high risk, right? And so compare this number with this number, right? They are strikingly different. So this is what I would like to stress. Before conflict breaks out, it's really hard to predict conflict. Once conflict broke out, it's quite easy to predict conflict because you just need to have the dynamics. And of course, don't take my word for it, you know, take Chris's word for it. Even with such unusually rich data, however, the models poorly predict new outbreaks of escalations of violence. And this is coming from a country, you know, country study, so disaggregated data. And not cross-country. So this is a very, very common feature of conflict. And, you know, the views effort financed by an ERC, amazing project by Harvard, Hager, and Uppsala. And what they end up doing is they basically, I mean, I'm caricaturing it a little bit, but only a little bit, is basically they use history, cell history to predict more conflict, right? So in Muller and Rao, we call this the hard problem, and this is what I'm going to use to describe this thing. So the hard problem is that if you want to do prediction on like the new outbreaks, you are facing a very, very low baseline risk. And I do think we should nonetheless care about this, because these are the places that are in the danger of falling into the war trap. These are the places where if you prevent something from escalating, you prevent something from falling into this trap where you then caught in this lower right corner, okay? So what we do is we use data from the VC monitor, and we feed this into an LDA. I've talked about this before, so I don't want to bore you guys with our forecasting method in detail, but it's based on the latent digital allocation, so-called topic model. We tacked up a lot here using the Gensim package. This allows us to estimate what's called a dynamic topic model, which is just updated monthly. We need to do this. We need to re-estimate the model every month, because we want to always put ourselves into a place and then predict the next month, and then see how we're doing in the next month, and then do the next month, and so on and so forth, so to get really true out of sample performance statistics. This is how what the kind of topic model generates. It generates this list of words, probability distributions across different words. And here the names come from us. So it's terror, military, politics, and economics come from us. The algorithm doesn't know this, but it's completely endogenously generated. And it's seeing that some articles always write about these words together, and they write about these words together, and about these words together. And so it makes topics around them. And this is very useful, because we can then use this aggregation into topics to forecast violence. The big advantage here, obviously, being that when you try to predict something that happens very rarely in cross-country data, you're facing actually a small data problem. You're not facing a big data problem. And so therefore, you need to use few features. Machine learning will not help you a lot in kind of understanding this. You can just throw all the variables at it like that. And so topics have another big advantage, and I want to talk about this because this is kind of something new. And actually, I was panicking when Corona broke out, because I thought, oh no, now we're going to face the same thing that Google faced when they had this flu prediction thing, right? So now people are going to write about kill and die and so on, and all our forecasts are going to go completely through the roof. Here's a topic which we didn't know, which we never paid attention to in January 2020. It's hospital area, water, I don't know. I think this is kind of like health and emergencies. This changes in the next dynamic iteration in February 2020 towards coronavirus outbreak, and now it has become, you know, completely coronavirus, patient health. So this has taken on basically the coronavirus, and it has isolated basically the information and the share of the coronavirus into this topic, and it's absorbed it in that, and the whole conflict topics, they all remain completely free, so to speak, from the virus. So kind of good news for us. So how are we predicting? We always use history dummies, so some history information and some our text information, and we always go month by month, not quarter. So this is a typo, and we use it to predict always the t+1, and then I'm recording these values. And what I'm going to show you now is based basically on predictions from 2005 till now, and always checking how we were doing at each point in time. But think of this as like, I think it's around 10, 15,000, maybe 20,000 observations at the country month level of risk estimates, right? And of course, I can rank all my country months according to the risk that we estimated at that country month. And this is going to be important now going forward. This is how we're doing. This is how history is doing, right? History is really strong. The combined model that I'm plotting here is taking all its power in the beginning, right after a conflict ends from the history, and text alone is not doing that well. It's doing pretty good, but it's not doing that well. And then very quickly, history loses its power and text remains powerful. So basically, our forecast helps you predict the hard cases, right? So the text really helps you very quickly. After around 2 years, the text is what makes our model survive, basically. And so here are some plots. I'm not going to go. I think I'm going to run out of time, so I'm not going to go through this in detail. But you see Belarus like shooting up, and this is the kind of information we're going to make available coming forward in the next 2-3 months through a webpage that I, of course, will circulate. And I think it's very useful data to study. Also, kind of the false positives, right? What happened here? Why does it de-escalate again? Venezuela, you see slowly escalating. United States, very interesting, right? United States, you see this massive escalation with the racial riots, and maybe Trump had a small part in this. Let's see what happens under Biden now, right? And so let's go back to this Markov chain model. What we can do here is I can introduce a new state, which I call high risk, if the fitted values cross the threshold in this area, and can then say, let's think about an intervention where you have distinguished some high risk states from the low risk states. So let me do that. So what I've done now, I've used our forecast model and say, look, if you are not after conflict, and if your forecast is above 0.2, let's call you high risk, right? And so what does that do? Well, it introduces a new state. This new state has a much higher probability of going into conflict now, right? So I've kind of isolated from a baseline risk of only 0.26%. After sudden, I'm in an area of 4%. Of course, this is not great, right? This is not like this is 4%. That's what it is. But I think it's an elevated risk.
Hannes, just your 9 or 10 minute warning.
Okay, thank you. And so now we can use this to kind of study what would happen if you would intervene here and you would try to move probability mass away from this escalation probability, and you would move that mass towards de-escalation, right? So that's the policy experiment I'm now thinking about, and I'm kind of simulating the world using this Markov chain table, basically. And this allows me to simulate the future, right, under different scenarios. What happens with an intervention, what happens without intervention, and so on. Now, if I change the cutoff, I'm now taking a lower cutoff, which means many more cases are called high risk. You see that the precision of the forecast falls dramatically, right? I have more cases now in this area, which makes this more persistent, and more places go into high risk. But of course, I can study different cutoffs as well. Okay, just to say this and stress this, the world is currently not doing a lot in terms of interventions here in the high risk. So high risk is really something that maybe the UN knows, but not a lot of WikiLeaks cables in the United States diplomatic system definitely doesn't see this coming. Okay, so now let's. I'm going to go to the theory now. So we model intervention as an optimal stopping problem. There's a discount factor. There's a policy indicator. We have a state at time t, which is either the pre-conflict piece, conflict, or post-conflict piece, and we have a vector of information, which is kind of all the dynamics that I showed you about in the Markov chain. But of course, this could be anything. And then we have a revenue function. Of course, this I'm going to be completely like making up myself now. But of course, I fed it with the values that I think are reasonable, which is a function of both the state you're in, right? If you're in conflict, this will be lower, and if you're intervening, this will be also lower, right? It will be costly to intervene. And then we have a transition function, which is used to construct the expected value going forward. And here we're going to use the Markov chain. And then G is kind of keeping track of how information accumulates. Let me just, because I will run out of time, let me jump to the model basically. So the value function conditional on a particular choice, dt, is this, right? So it's the payoff you get next period from next period's outcome, given that you're doing something, and the kind of transition likelihoods that you're facing. So these are the likelihoods that you end up in these different states in the future. And of course, your intervention is always this dt, and this will affect the probabilities by which you're transitioning into these places. Here, note that I use dt here to calculate the revenue, so the payoffs. This is because you're taking the action before you realize what the transition will be, right? So you don't want to intervene everywhere, because that will generate lots of false positive interventions. You will spend money in places where you don't want to actually spend money. And so this is kind of keeping you from intervening in lots of places. And there's another way to write this, which is kind of a more forward-looking. So this is kind of a one-shot intervention. And this is kind of like if you write the full thing down with, there's a value function. Once you are in that state, then you can determine again whether you want to intervene then, and so on and so forth. So this is like the full model, and where the value function is given by this. You probably all know these kind of models, so I'm not going to go into detail here. But what I would like to show you is, okay, again, reminding you the kind of policy we're doing. The policy is like moving this probability mass here. What I'd like to show you is how this looks like in a space of damage cost. So this is once conflict breaks out, how much does it cost you per month? And conflict persistence here on the y-axis. Conflict persistence is this thing here, right? This is this here. This number here is conflict persistence. So when we reduce conflict persistence, we reduce it from this 85% almost towards the post piece, right? It's becoming less and less persistent. And so we're playing with this parameter. In the one-shot game, it doesn't matter, because you're just trying to prevent conflict from happening, but you don't care whether you stay in conflict a lot once you're there or not. However, if you are in the recursive model, right, then you care. You care whether it's a war trap or whether it's just like this one-off conflict that is happening. So conflict persistence has this huge effect on whether you want to intervene or not. By the way, green means you intervene, and white means you don't intervene. And so there's this trade-off, right? So in the dynamic model, so to speak, the damage cost per month and the persistence of the conflict are kind of traded off against each other, right? So if I just moved the lower cutoff, if I would have used the lower cutoff, which leads to this lower precision, then I don't want to intervene at all almost. And here you see there's just this very dramatic trade-off here at the very corner. I want to just intervene here. And what this tells you, and I think this is kind of where I think my time is running out really, what this tells you is that in this kind of framework allows you not only to think about, how big is the treatment effect, how effective is your policy, but also how good is your forecast. And the worse your forecast, the less you want to intervene. So you're actually able, in this kind of framework, you're able to trade off the persistence of the forecast with the size of the treatment effect and the persistence and the damage of that conflict does, right? So all these elements can kind of be baked together in kind of one framework, and you can think about both optimal forecasting and optimal intervention in this framework. Okay, if you make conflict de-escalating, you want to do it much more, and it's kind of talking about precision. Here is another curve that shows how great precision works. Okay, so let me conclude. I've provided like a forecast plus a dynamic decision-making model. I think the Markov chain model is incredibly useful to model conflict and to model these dynamics of the conflict trap or war trap, no matter how you want to call it. And our future steps in this project, and of course I'm very curious about what you think about this, is to model interventions actually in the forecast, right? And think about what if in the past people had intervened and the forecast result we get is already the result of an intervention. For example, the UN sanctions seem to be reacting to risk, and then bring the dynamic decision making to the machine learning actually, because right now we do the forecasting with a classifier that is just putting some equal cost to false positives and false negatives. But of course, we know that some things are more costly than other things. And what if we can actually use the machine and tell the machine, look, pay much more attention to these cases, pay less attention to these cases, right? Will it learn those other instances better? And that's my hope, that actually we can kind of grow this decision-making problem back into the machine learning. And let me just stress this again, what I said in the beginning. I'm doing increasingly these evaluations now for a think tank in the United States. We want to talk to the Congress. They want to lobby the Congress to put pressure on the Ethiopian government, and the cost of conflict in Ethiopia. What is it? Can you evaluate what policy action would do here? And I think it's like we are really lacking sound frameworks for evaluating this kind of stuff, and somebody does this anyway. So I think improving this and doing this better would be really useful. So thank you very much.
Great. So I will say I think people should feel free to just shout out, but if you want to raise your hand as well during another question, feel free.
I have a small question. Did you try to look at instances in which your empirical model is mostly is wrong? Just look at where the predicted versus actual is the largest, both in positive and negative direction. And then if you can look at these cases, then what explains this difference? Whether it's some completely unpredictable events, I don't know, coronavirus or something of that sort, or it's something related to policy, to international organization that explains why sometimes unexpectedly conflict goes up, sometimes unexpectedly it goes down.
Thank you. Yes, actually, we have looked a lot at this, and making these forecasts public is part of the reason is that I want to make this available. We want to make this available for other researchers as well, exactly to study the kind of cases where false positives happen or surprises happen. Let me tell you about one really interesting false positive, which is in the text model at least. So if you rely more on text, you pick up more low risks, the early risks, right? Chile. So there was a massive escalation of risk in Chile, and it looked like it would become a conflict, and it has de-escalated, according to our estimates at least, dramatically. So what happened in Chile, I think my interpretation of what happened in Chile is that the government reacted quite strongly, to this and made policy concessions, and the situation calmed down. So I do think that, maybe our forecasts can allow us to help study these instances where nothing happens, right? Which is the kind of goal of prevention. Of course, there's, this is, the precision is not great, right? So there's lots of mistakes everywhere. The one example, of course, is kind of sudden terror attacks. It's very hard to predict those. In Europe, especially, we didn't pick up some of those. Although I have to say that the atmosphere that you get from the news in countries like Germany, Spain, and France did sour before the terror attacks happened. So there was a little signal there, but of course it's not, these are fairly unforeseen events. I showed you Tunisia. Tunisia is kind of incredible, but it of course depends a little bit on how the conflict is coded. Our model predicts a very high risk in Tunisia immediately when the Arab Spring starts. It doesn't anticipate the Arab Spring, but immediately once the Arab Spring starts and people are on the streets and people are rioting, immediately it says, look, there's a high chance of this escalating, right? So this is how the model works. It's more like, I mean, it picks up some very, very subtle signals, but usually it's like if the situation changes and such that there's people on the streets, people are rioting, then it will give us a higher risk. It's more or less how it works.
So I have one question. I guess the battle threshold you'd be using for predicting the re-outbreak of war, just the initial outbreak of war, is this 25 battle deaths in a year. And so how much of this, I'm not sure if that's true for the monthly data. I don't know what the thresholds are, but how much, whatever it is.
Monthly is, yeah, everything.
Okay, so, monthly is everything. So I mean, so could what be happening is there's some low scale violence, which could be quite serious. So you could have aerial attacks between two sides, 5 people are killed, and that gets reported, and then that's likely to predict something over the threshold in the next period.
I mean, I'm absolutely sure that some of this is going on, right? So there's some violence that happens, exactly what I said, riots, right? So there is smashing and there's organization and there's people being attacked, and you see the words attack and so on and so forth, and the text picks that up and stores that up, and you don't, right? It's kind of like conflict predicting conflict. We're trying to, in the other paper, in the previous paper, we're trying to pay a lot of attention to this, like what are the topics doing that are especially negatively correlated with the onset, right? So there's several topics that are negatively correlated, and we try to pay special attention to what is the job that they are doing, right? So economics falling, business news falling, all this stuff that also helps predict. So it's not only conflict predicting conflict. I will not lie about this. This is definitely going on to some degree. So it's partly basic UCDP not coding it yet as conflict, and we are picking that up. I mean, this is definitely happening to some degree, but it's definitely more than that as well. It's not just conflict predicts conflict, and that's what we pick up. I still think it would be interesting, but
is there, maybe it doesn't exist but there's no. I wonder if you could actually imagine partitioning your words and the signals you're getting into things that sound like conflict, like pre-conflict, right? So low scale conflict. Yeah. And you could almost imagine, one is you could just say, what happens if we take those out? I wouldn't be surprised if your model performs similarly well. But I wonder if you could almost put those into the dependent variable, right? Just sort of say, well, actually, now let's actually use this and try to call these low scale violence that we're going to measure what UCDP has maybe observed but not coded or not observed. Push that into the dependent variable, and I'm going to show you that we can. I suspect you do quite a good job at predicting that as well.
Let me tell you one thing that we are doing, and I think this is answering your question to a much more satisfaction than my previous answer. What we are also doing is that we do this really harsh thing where we just say the month before conflict breaks out is a 1 and everything else is a 0. Now let's expand the months before and code them to be a 1, like before they're basically indicating a pre-conflict. And if you do that for a year, right, then you're really far away from the actual outbreak according to UCDP, and you're more and more in situations that actually nothing has escalated yet. And it's incredible how persistent the performance is. Basically, it falls slightly, but it doesn't fall as dramatically as you would expect if it's just picking up like this, there's a build up and then it explodes. There seems to be more broader movement. I mean, look at the United States, right? Of course, it's going up, but it's not going all the way back down immediately, right? The risk stays up, and it kind of means that there is a dialogue. There's a whole atmosphere basically that is capturing. And Venezuela is another example where I think this is definitely true. So I'm fairly confident that it's not only that, but it's a good idea. We could use ACLED, right? We could obviously use ACLED to get at riots, for example, and see whether that's destroying our forecast power. Yeah, thank you for that.
Could I just ask, is it obvious at what frequency you want to run this exercise? So you know, if you did it minute by minute, it would become even more impossible as a prediction exercise and be meaningless, right?
Yes.
But in some ways, you know, especially when it comes to sort of conflict prevention, having this sort of almost real-time thing that you describe, I'm not sure how, even in sort of policy usefulness, how helpful it is. So maybe a related exercise would just be to say, you know, what are the characteristics of places where in 5 years on average something happens versus nothing happens, rather than this Markov chain thing, which says, you know, once you fight, you continue fighting. So have you given any thought to what the trade-offs here are?
Actually, it's very interesting you asked this, because we started with a yearly one, like a few years ago. People were criticizing us, why don't you do quarterly, monthly? And actually, this is one of the reasons that we did what I just said to Chris. Now we do a year ahead, right? The nice thing is, if the more you slice it, the more you are flexible in like what you want to do then. Like, do you aggregate it back up or not, right? And what I'm telling you is that a year ahead, it's the persist, like we can predict it, and actually it's of course it's grabbing much more topics that are kind of economics and business and so on, that they're floating much more into the prediction framework. But it's not a dramatic change. So it's not like this model is only the 1 month ahead model, and then forget about that when you have broader horizons. And I completely agree with you. It's probably not very interesting to do this 1 month ahead, just 1 month ahead. We need to have 3 months ahead, 12 months ahead. Sadly, I feel that policymakers often do not think about 5 months ahead. My feeling is that we are already very challenging them a lot by doing a year ahead. But to then answer your, I think, a more kind of critical question, which is like, what happens if you do a 5 years ahead? This is definitely going to break it in a way, because you end up with a data set that just has a few hundred observations, right? And you will pick up very, very broad trends that I think cannot be distinguished anymore from, I would say, the conflict dynamics. You basically end up, I think, with the conflict dynamics logic, and you will be, I don't think it will be possible to pick up the hard cases. That will be my intuition.
Okay.
If I may ask a question.
I think we're just at break. So Dominic, how do you want to handle that? People can continue to ask questions during the break, and you're the boss here.
No, not the boss. Yeah, no, I think if you want to keep chatting, that's fine. And the other ones who want to have a cup of tea or something. So we're gonna resume in 5 minutes, basically. In 5 minutes with your talk, Chris. Yeah. So let's take a break, but keep chatting. Those who want to chat.
I stay here. Yeah, of course. If you have questions, I'm super happy to
yeah. So going back to Chris's point, like he said, how do you get confidence in the predictions of the model? So can you do something in terms of explaining which kind of words in a particular topic help in explaining conflict? So I'm just asking from a point of view of explainability in AI models, right?
Yeah. No,
useful.
Yeah. So this is a good point. We have never dared to go back to the words, to be very honest. It's very hard for me to think about how we would do that. We lose basically the word information, and we're just treating things as the share of the topics, right? Even with those shares of the topics, we are starting to have a hard time to know exactly what goes on, because we use random forests, right? And so Christopher very recently found this, the Shapley value is a very nice way to describe what's going on.
Yeah.
And this will kind of revolutionize the way we think about our own forecast. And you do see exactly what I described. Sorry, I didn't describe this yet, but kind of in the top of the tree, what it does, it's kind of picking the conflict history, and it's looking whether the country's in a history or not, right? And then it goes down the tree, and then further down the tree, it starts to use it starts to use the topics. And the kind of non-conflict topics, they come at the very end. Kind of they only start to kick in once all the other stuff has been ruled out, right? You can't distinguish this country from another country if you don't use like topics like business and economics. So yes, we can talk about which are the topics that are kind of correlated, and we talk a lot about like, are they positively or negatively correlated? Because I find that very interesting that a lot of power is coming from negative correlations, right? So something falling predicts conflict instead of something going up. But I think the best that I could come up with is like, or we could come up with is this Shapley value thing where we ordered according to the depth of the tree where you are, and then showing the Shapley value. But going to the word level, I have to admit, it would be very super hard. I mean, in the webpage that we're going to provide, we were able to kind of get some very good graphic designers enthusiastic about this project, and we're going to show the full, the full word bubbles, and it will allow people to interact with the kind of the topics changing and the share of the topics changing and the words inside the topics changing and how that relates to the risk. And I think myself, I will learn a lot from having it visualized that way for the first time. But it was very hard for us without any visualization tool to do this. So I don't have a good answer to your question, but I think it's important because exactly we're pushing in this direction to kind of make it visual and make us ourselves understand what's going on inside the models.
Okay, thank you.
This here is Medellin. It's, if you don't know Medellin, it's the second largest city in Colombia. It's the industrial and commercial heartland. It's fairly wealthy. It has a strong state in the sense that it's highly professionalized, highly capable technocrats, lots of tax revenues, lots of infrastructure, lots of social programs, and a reasonably professionalized police force. Now, it's true that there was a lot of in-migration, a lot of informality, and a lot of informal neighborhoods without services, but at least for 30, 40 years, almost everywhere has been serviced by the government, if not much, much longer. Even so, as you go into, you don't pick almost any middle or low income neighborhood in the city. And you go in and if they have if somebody has a dispute with their neighbor, or they need to evict a tenant, or there's a party where the noise is too loud, or someone's harassing their daughter on the street, or someone's shoplifting from your store, you might reach out to the police or one of the state authorities and municipal agencies, or you might call the combo. Now, what's a combo? Hang on a second. So here's two pictures of a combo, and they both reflect aspects of these, what are essentially street gangs. And the picture on the left is probably a lot of street gangs worldwide. They're young men in their teens and 20s. I think this comes from one of their Facebook pages. And they not only run their local retail drug markets, they do some debt collection and lending, and they extort businesses. But these are also relatively sophisticated, well-run enterprises. And if you look at the picture on the right, this is where we're interviewing their Santiago, and we're interviewing the leader of maybe one of the more organized combos, but they're all extremely well organized. He's older, so he's in his 30s. That's very common. And in addition to providing, in addition to running these illicit businesses, which can be quite sophisticated, he's also to some extent governing his neighborhood. They've built the thing you see behind him is a little craft stall they've built for youth to sort of learn crafts and trades. They're running a recycling center that's behind that. They run a community pool that's beside that. So, and that's of course this is one of the highest, gang governed neighborhoods in the city, but most neighborhoods are governed by their local gang to some degree. What you see here is a map of Medellin, and what we've done is every neighborhood highlighted in some color is a lower middle income neighborhood. And so here, which is El Poblado, and here are wealthier neighborhoods. So we didn't run our survey there because we know for a fact there's no combos. But if you look at any other neighborhood from these middle income, which are darker red, to the lowest income, you see a huge number of about 300 combos. This is a combo census we've been doing. We've been piecing together both the existence, the name, some basic information, and also an estimated location, not quite a centroid, but say a main intersection or somewhere where we really know to be quite central to their territory. And so there's about 300 in all, maybe 350 in the broader metropolitan area. And it's not just a phenomenon up on the tall, steep mountainsides here or here, and in the poorest neighborhoods. They're quite frequent even in some of the higher middle income neighborhoods as well. And then most of them have been around for 30 or 40 years. Now, how do we know what we know? Well, I'm going to present to you, we have the citywide survey, which we ran about a year ago, which gathers citizen responses to who governs their neighborhood and the extent to which they work with the combo and the state. And I'm going to show you that in a moment. But we began 4 years ago trying to actually develop contacts within these organizations. And so far we've developed contacts with about 30 to 35 criminal organizations. We're interviewing low, middle, actually senior ranking members. We try to interview them multiple times when we can. We try to get multiple sources for each organization. So it might be more than one member, or it might be a member of the organization, then some outside expert who really knows that territory, maybe a security official who is assigned to that territory and knows a great deal. We've been working closely with the city's premier crime journalist and gang journalist. We've got a former criminal group member who was a leader and then reformed himself, was a city outreach worker, and now he works for us full time, conducting interviews of many of his former peers. And we've interviewed maybe, I think, 70 or 75 leaders in all, amongst other interviews. And so a lot of our data comes from, of how these organizations operate and why, comes from these interviews. And this is a much bigger project where we're not just trying to understand why gangs govern their communities, which is what I'm going to talk about today. We're trying to understand the personnel economics of the gang. We're trying to understand the industrial organization and the market relationships and how they run their cartels, and things that will be a series of other papers, and I'm happy to talk about in questions. But what I'm going to talk about today is this phenomenon, and what this is each of these 17 items here are questions that in every barrio, there's about 220 something low and middle income barrios or neighborhoods in the city. We have representative data from each of those barrios, maybe 20 or 30 households and businesses per barrio. And we ask them, so if we ask households or businesses, you know, when someone's making noise in your neighborhood, so there's a party and you need to, and it's interfering, like, who do you call? Or sorry, not who do you call, rather, who tends to intervene and with what frequency? And you get what we've adjusted here to a 0 to 1 scale. 1 would be the state. Here in the first column, we ask how the state and the combo, how likely they are to intervene. And 1 would mean they always intervene. 0 would mean never. You can think of a 0.4, 0.5 as sometimes, you know, 0.2 is 3 as rarely, 0.6 as often or frequently. And so the state is sort of sometimes intervene in these noise disputes. And the is actually, you know, is intervening, but not nearly as frequently. This isn't necessarily something they govern or that they regulate in the neighborhood quite so frequently. And so the difference between the relative difference on this task is about 0.2. And we've ordered these from where the combo is relatively unlikely to intervene compared to the state down to where the combo is most likely to intervene relative to the state. So debt collection is one where the combo, not surprisingly, is much more effective than the courts. And the average of all these 17 things is here. It's about 0.4 for the state, 0.3 for the combo. So all of them are getting sometimes governed by one organization or the other. No organization is providing terrific or frequent governance. And on balance, the state is a little bit more likely to govern. So maybe not especially surprising. And this is probably for about, these are neighborhoods that are going to cover all of our combos. These averages conceal a lot of variation. So here's a map of the barrios. Any color from blue to sort of salmony to red are one of the lower middle income neighborhoods from where we have data. I should mention these are barrio borders and not combo borders. We know some of the combo borders, but we don't know the combo borders for all 300. So we can't map these precisely to the full combo territory. So for this analysis, I'm just showing you barrios. And in the blue, the light blue to darker blue neighborhoods, these are places where on balance, people report that the state's more likely to intervene than the combo. All right, and you can see that there's a huge number of light blue neighborhoods, which means that there's actually a degree of balance between who's intervening and who's not. And then there's a tremendous number of these sort of salmony and red colored neighborhoods where the combo is more likely to intervene than the state. And I should mention that all of these barrios have fairly strong combos, and the combos are running the drug markets and many other business lines in all of these neighborhoods. And then whether or not they govern is in some sense a choice. So if you look up at the northern, these comunas and barrios up on the northern border, there's a lot of variation. These are some of the strongest, most deeply penetrated combos in the city within their neighborhood, but in some of these neighborhoods, they're choosing to govern and in some they don't. So why briefly, we can show some data, but what are we learning from some of these interviews, and what does some of the data that we're seeing suggest? Well, one is that, basically providing governance services in return for fees, like the fees that day for that service, but also extortion as essentially a weekly subscription fee to the security and dispute resolution services that the combo provides, is a business line for the combo. And they levy it based on the neighborhoods where they choose to offer that business line. They have the capacity to offer that business line, even within their territory. It might be not very uniform. They're sort of choosing to offer this business where they, as a means of earning revenues. And the gang has lots of comparative advantages that may give them a lower marginal cost than the state. They have lots of close information. They've got good relationships, and they can very selectively use the means of coercion. But what comes up again and again from interviews with leaders is that there's two, you could think of them as externalities within the gang itself. So externalities to other aspects of running the combo. One is that running this particular governance business line has positive effects, positive externalities on other business lines, particularly the sale of drugs, but also the other local monopolies they would have over a lot of consumer products. So, and there's two reasons for this. One is if you keep problems from erupting in your neighborhood, or if you control problems when they arise, then the police or people from city agencies have less need to come in. And when they have less need to come in, they're less likely to notice the drug corner, or customers are less likely to scatter, or the people who are running the drug corner are less likely to be arrested. And so it's basically going to have a positive externality on the profits for your other enterprises. The second reason is that it's also going to, they say it's going to foster civilian loyalty, and thus reduce the likelihood that civilians collaborate with the state, either informing on them, or when the state does come to try to arrest, the extent to which the local population hide them or conceal them, or not provide information. And so these basically have direct effects on their other business lines. The other set of things that these leaders repeatedly talk about are sort of another set of like non-pecuniary benefits that they get that aren't necessarily linked to the other business line, but it may be the idea that they get status or power or the respect of locals, so they like being a big man, so this is sort of a direct benefit from civilian loyalty. They also have a different idea about what kinds of regulations should be enforced in the neighborhood. They tend to be socially very conservative. They tend to be very right-wing. They've been very anti-communist, anti-guerrilla for many, many decades. So they have a different idea of what kinds of moral and economic regulations ought to be enforced in the neighborhood. And so they may actually derive utility from enforcing differently than the government would. Here's for example, and sorry, on this idea that and we see some evidence in the data, and because it's a short presentation, I won't go into all detail. But for example, when it comes to government services as a business line, if you just focus on the graph on the right, this is the proportion of people in the neighborhood who say that the combo taxes businesses or residents in their neighborhood. And as you can see, it goes from neighborhood, nobody claims that the combo taxes them, up to neighborhoods where everyone says that the combo taxes people in the neighborhood, and everything in between. So there's a lot of variation. Combos are electing whether or not to do this, and essentially the tax incidence or the fiscal capacity they've chosen to develop and the number of people and businesses that they're collecting from can vary quite a great deal, and it's very strongly related to the likelihood that they're governing. So we're mostly going to try to, the main purpose of this paper is to ask what the government can do about this. But first it sort of helps to talk a little bit about one of the ways we've conceptualized this. I'm not going to go deep into the model. I'll just talk about it in a slide or two in very general terms, partly because of the time. But one way we could think of this is, these combos are a little bit like firms and they're a little bit like states. And so we could write a more duopolistic model of firm competition, like a Cournot model. Or we could write more of a traditional sort of contest model between political economy model, and just to help structure some of our empirical predictions. And so we sort of say, well, what happens if we combine these two things? What happens if we take like a very traditional kind of Cournot model where each side, now the model we actually use in the paper has differentiated products, and I don't show that here just because it gets more complex. So this is a slightly simpler version of what we do than what we do in the paper, but a really simple Cournot model where there's this revenue motive or this profit motive in this specific business line, the market for services, but then we allow for the fact that there are these two externalities within the gang. One is that there may be these direct payoffs, so positive utility directly gained from governing yourself. That's the gang's quantity of governance provided, or we suspect this is probably decreasing the degree to which the state is providing a quantity of services. So you maybe like to be the sole provider, or you like to be the dominant provider in your neighborhood in some cases. You could think of this as, here's the monopoly profits from the drug business, right? But whatever the pool of rents is there, you could also think of this as like a contest success function that's increasing. This is quantity of governance as essentially as arming. So governance as arming, and the more likely it is that the more I invest in these arms, the more likely I'm going to win this contest for this pool of profits. Doesn't really matter what the functional form looks like. This is just illustrative. What's more important are these basic comparative statics. The first, and as we'll see, especially the second derivatives with respect to the quantity of your own governance as a gang and the quantity that the state governs. The basic prediction that you get from the simplest Cournot is that unless these goods are complements, which we don't think they are, unless these goods are complements, then if the state were to sort of suddenly decrease its marginal cost of providing these services, or if it were to have some exogenous increase in, say, the payoffs to governing in itself, maybe there's an electoral incentive where people are going to reward the state for becoming the monopolist, then we should expect to see any increase in state governance decreasing the quantity of governance that the gang is offered. And then we would expect these direct payoffs or these other externalities to moderate that potentially, just as we would expect any imperfect substitutability between state and gang governance to moderate that effect. But still, we predicted that the state could crowd out the gang. And in some sense, this is consistent with like a huge literature, whether it's on counterinsurgency or whether it's on the birth of the Sicilian Mafia or the birth of American prison gangs, that sees an absence of state governance as the source of gang governance. And an implicit assumption in a lot of the policy and a lot of the discussion of these historical cases that had the state governed, or in circumstances where the state provided more governance, were able to crowd out the gangs. What's interesting, though, is we don't in the data see a negative correlation between gang governance and state governance, right? So what I show here, this is sort of this is a combo governance index and the state's governance index in each neighborhood. After we've parceled out lots of things like income and demographics and steepness of the neighborhood, right? So this isn't well identified. I don't want to pretend that this is But this should account for a lot of the, we still anticipated a negative relationship here. And what we actually see is that even controlling for income and demographics and such, that the places that are well governed by the state are also well governed by the combo. But we thought this is probably confounded by unobservables. And so let's look quasi-experimentally and experimentally at this relationship. And as a little bit of a preview, we're not going to see any evidence of gang crowd out. We're going to run the first experiment, a gang level randomized control trial, I think that maybe ever been run on any topic. We're going to intensely try to govern certain gang held neighborhoods. And we're going to see no evidence of crowd out in terms of gang rule. We're also going to show a longer run quasi experiment, which I'll talk about first, where we're going to see over the span of 20 or 30 years, it looks like the places where the state really tried to intervene more, you saw an increase in combo governance. And so we'll try to talk about why. But what the model predicts is this partial derivative. This can be positive, and it really has a great deal to do with these, basically to what extent, to this sort of cross-partial elasticity. All right, and so we have to think about, like, what are the sets of circumstances in which the incentives for combos are to govern more when the city governs. And the short answer is that it's when the market for these services, when this is a very low profit, when the profit margins from this are actually very low, but the payoffs, particularly onto the drug market, are extremely high. And we think that's what's going on. But let me first sort of show you, our empirical evidence on how elastic is criminal governance to the projection of state power. The first thing we do, which is a quasi experiment, is we take the fact that all of these 260 barrios in the city were organized in the late 1980s into comunas. So there's maybe there's 16 comunas, urban comunas in all. And these dots that you see here are all the blocks. It's a random sample of the blocks within the barrios, and hence the comuna, where we collected data. And so we have this late 2019 data. And some of these neighborhoods are close to a comuna border, and some of them are far. And when we think about city services, a lot of city services, hospitals, schools, etc., are provided to people irrespective of their location in the city. If you live in this comuna, you can go to the school or the hospital over here. But there are a set of services that were organized along comuna lines. One of them were police patrols, and so here each comuna have made 1, 2, in some cases 3 local police stations, and also a package of municipal services, often headquartered in the same place as what they call the Casa de Justicia, the Justice House. So that's the headquarters for the dispute resolution providers. That's usually also the headquarters for family services, and a package of comuna level services that would put street level bureaucrats on your block. And so the idea is potentially that the further away you are from these headquarters, the less likely it is that you're either aware of these services or that these street level bureaucrats are coming and delivering these services to you. And the way we look at that is we say, okay, suppose we take advantage of this border discontinuity, and we compare two blocks on either side. And we compare how, here's a block that's very close to its municipal services. Here's one that's relatively further away. And what is the impact of that on the change in relative state governance of what's the impact on state governance, and then what's also the impact on combo governance. And when you cross that border, if we create matched pairs across these borders of blocks, and we ask what's the difference in their distance from the state, well, some of them are equally distant from the state. They're both, there's almost no difference in their distance to the state. Some of them at the 90th percentile are more a kilometer different from where they are in their relative placement to their local state. And at the median, it's about 400 meters. And so as I talk about the results and interpret them, I'll talk about this, we'll sort of focus on this median. And we call that our main treatment, which is the change in distance to the local state when you cross the border. And the way we identify this is, we're going to regress this difference in relative state governance on the local distance to the state. We're going to control for all the other things that, frankly, we don't expect there to be a discontinuity for. Relative distance to business agglomerations, relative differences to schools, relative differences to all sorts of state institutions that are not linked to the Comuna. We're going to be adding, the only thing we haven't added yet is relative distance to drug plazas run by combos, which we have some data on. We control for a bunch of baseline characteristics, basically come from the 1993 census and a bunch of geographic measures. We use a border fixed effect. So each border here has a fixed effect. And then we need control for some running variable to the border in terms of, because some blocks are going to be closer or further from the border. So what do we find? Well, let's just think about the state governance index. So remember that was 0.4 overall in that very first table I showed you. It's in the subsample close to the border. It's also roughly identical. So these border communities or border blocks are not that different from the average blocks. And what happens when you move, when you cross the border and you get 100 meters further away? Well, as you get further away from the state, your state governance goes down. So it's consistent with this idea that you get further from these street level bureaucrats, and it goes down by about 0.02. At the median, this changes 400 meters. So you multiply this by 4 to 0.08. That's about a 20% decline in governance. Or basically the extent to which you say the state intervenes when these kinds of problems arise. We anticipated that the combo governance index would have the opposite sign. And we anticipated that combos would step in and provide more governance where the state was relatively more absent. And we actually find, the opposite of that. It's highly significant. And as a proportion of the coefficient is a little bit smaller, but as a proportion of baseline combo governance in this neighborhood, it's about a 20% decrease in combo governance as you get further from the state. And what that means is there's no difference in relative state governance. Yes.
No, just as a chair, just let you know that the 25 minutes mark is getting closer.
Okay. I'm almost done. So okay, so we don't see any evidence of crowding out, but we also think, what happens, but that's a quasi-experimental evaluation. What we had also been doing at the same time, I'll try to explain this very quickly, then we can do the rest in questions, we discover, actually 2 or 3 years ago, we discover an intervention where the city has gone into one neighborhood and really tried to govern the heck out of it by providing a bunch of full-time street level bureaucrats to do a lot of the same role and to help liaise people with the city government and give them more extensive, better quality services. Basically, link them up to all of the things that the city offers, but they might not have been receiving. So we talk to the mayor and persuade them to scale this up. So identify 80 communities where there's a very strong gang presence, and the state has been somewhat weak, and 40 of them get a full-time liaison, 2 years, who provides a whole set of outreach activities. Partly they're helping coordinate and organize the community, like here's the garbage spot, let's agree on how we pick up the dog excrement, and so forth. But we're going to hold meetings with the various municipal staff and senior leaders and the police. But we're mostly just going to refer you to all the city services, like the dispute resolution or the family services, so that these street level bureaucrats are aware of you and they're coming here. And the city's also going to run a caravana that is really saying we're here. It's a party and a sort of national event for 3 days where all the municipal agencies come and provide information, and everybody from the neighborhood for a few blocks comes, and there's food and music, but they talk to the city agents. And so it's really supposed to sort of make the state very visible and present, not just symbolically, but actually every week these liaisons have quarters for referring people to these agencies. And again, we don't really find, we find that it's not at all what we predicted. In the treated communities, again, the experimental sample has it's about 0.4 in terms of its state governance, 0.3 in terms of its combo governance. So they look a lot like our average communities in the whole city. But people report that the state is responding a little bit less, if anything, and the combo is responding a little bit more. It's really more of a 0, but there's certainly not going down. And relative state governance is actually a little bit lower after 2 years of intensive, like every day on the street presence. There's not really a change in relative state legitimacy. There's a little bit of a signal that people are responding that they trust the state and they think the state is, the appropriate provider in these communities, but no evidence that they're actually, people perceive them as responding more. What we'll say is one issue that we realized during the implementation is that part of this was a compliance problem, in the sense that people would say, well, we organized the meeting with all the city officials, but then they never came and we never found out why. Or in a couple of instances, I had trouble entering the territory because the combo wouldn't let me. And so there were some compliance issues, but the compliance issues were confined to a subsample. The compliance issues were confined to the places where the combo had really strong governance. So we document some of these compliance issues in the treatment communities, and we see that the index of these sorts of state failing to deliver is relatively low where the combo was not governing, and relatively high where they were governing. And fortunately, we had pre-specified this single subgroup analysis, expecting that these high combo governed neighborhoods, right, they all have strong combos, but not all of them chose to govern, might be different. And indeed, we do see that this backlash, this sort of failing of the treatment effect is far more negative and significant in the places where the combo initially ruled. So there's no basically this is backfiring in the places where the state basically has capacity constraints to deliver. But even in the neighborhoods where there's like modest levels of combo rule, so low is probably a misnomer, but where there's modest levels of rule, we still don't see them making any relative inroads. And if I were to break these are all relative state governance. If I was to break these into the state and combo governance indices that we were looking at previously, you'd see that actually in all of these cases, combo governance is either not changing or going up slightly, and there's there's either no change in here or decrease in people's perceived element of the state response. So basically, this isn't a case where we see them crowding in the combo as we did with the quasi experiment. That's longer term, that's a different kind of intervention, but there's certainly no crowding out, even in the neighborhoods here where we're confident that the compliance was high and the program worked extremely well. So, one of the conclusions we draw from this is that revenues from service provision are probably not the main motive for governing. It's primarily being driven by these externalities, and this is confirmed by interview after interview with gang members. This is going to suggest that even if you were to eliminate extortion, which many cities have done, it's hard to eliminate things like drug corners. Lots of cities have been able to eliminate extortion. You probably wouldn't impact the provision of gang-ruled services as a result. And it's going to be very difficult for governments to crowd out gangs simply by trying to govern better. They may actually have this perverse effect of having the gangs increase their governance. And so this has implications for future interventions, partly which we're still modeling, some of which we're still going to try to test experimentally or quasi-experimentally with the city. But that it may be that actually going after monopoly rents and drugs or trying to change social norms that influence civilian loyalty and how that's given to the gang and how citizens think of the gang might actually be more productive in terms of reducing gang rule and gang strength relative to some of these other interventions. So I will just leave it at that.
Very good. Let's open to the questions.
I have a question. Thanks a lot for this presentation. I was wanted to know whether they couldn't use another model. No, aren't there these models where like the competitor always chooses the same spot as the other competitor when they know they have lower marginal costs? Like, that's why you see shoe shops always in the same location. I mean, partly. Or whether you could just use a different IO model to kind of give you the effect that it's crowding in, because basically the gangs know that they're competing at several locations and they always, put more effort on those locations where the state is stepping up the effort. And that's,
if the gang, that's a good, what model, I don't know if you have, we can talk about it later. If you have specific models, I'd love to, I guess the that might make a lot more sense, especially if gang territories were really, really large and the government was only intervening in a part. And to some degree, that's true. But gang territories tend to be fairly small. And so my sense is that with the quasi-experiment in particular, they'd probably be getting treated relatively similarly.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Please, can I ask you, so maybe this is controversial, but is there any evidence that the state is very different from the combos? In the sense, I mean, if they are also to extort bribes or maybe to collude with the combos. So maybe that's a reason why you don't observe much crowding out.
Yeah, so there's a little bit in the sense that the police are poorly paid and the combos are extremely well paid. And so there's the police have the ability to shake them down. And we do have a lot of evidence that the gangs are paying, especially up the chain. Often they kick back some of that money into the police. Not as maybe systematically and as large an amount as you might expect, because this is, I think, a reasonably well-run police force. This is, there's a few instances as well where we see examples. I'd say they're more isolated than common, where the combo will arrest somebody for some offense, like maybe a rape, and then they'll hand them over to the police. So to the extent to which they, so in one of these simple models, if the police and the combos were complements, like they were occupying different levels of the value chain and one does better than the other one, that could certainly explain what's going on. Qualitatively, we don't hear a lot of those explanations, but theoretically, it's certainly plausible.
This work on Congo, on armed actors, Sanchez de la Sierra, it suggests that maybe there's complementarities across different areas, right? And you're measuring, I think you're measuring kind of a fairly broad area already, but maybe it's interesting to think about whether your index is constructed in the right way, isn't it? I don't know whether you do averages, but maybe you should, I mean, I don't know, right? But maybe legitimacy reacts much more to like you're doing this and you're doing this. And as opposed to you just provide security and you don't provide anything else. Have you thought about that? What, like, whether governance is like a multiplicative thing or an additive thing?
Yeah, yes. I mean, in the sense that, so first of all, I'd say the index is actually in some ways narrow because it's really focusing on street order and dispute resolution, I would say, for the most part. So, and there's many other aspects of governance where I think the state governance and combo governance are complements. So the infrastructure, for example, if the state provides infrastructure and maybe the markets are functioning better, there's more transactions, and thus there's more demand for the specific, for both dispute resolution and security, right?
Yes.
So in that sense, we think state governance is a complement, but that's not, that's not what we're measuring in the data. Our outcome is actually saying when you get more dispute resolution and security from the state, you get the same from the combo. So that narrower set of goods is not a substitute. If we try to break it down and look at treatment effects, quasi-experimental, experimental on the 17 subcomponents or sub-indices, we don't really see any difference. It seems to be pretty consistent across all 17.
Yeah, okay.
But it's a good point. I think Peter asked, it seems to treat the gangs as independent as the coordination between them and overarching structures. Absolutely. There's a lot of these are all independent firms that are in about 17 different conglomeration, or I wouldn't say conglomeration, alliances, headed by a mafia-like organization called the Raison. And that the other paper that we write, usually when I have more time, I talk about that. The other paper we're writing is about that. This is how they coordinate the drug. This is how they coordinate and collude on prices for street drugs across the city. So pretty much very similar price. It's also how they prevent a lot of conflict. So there's the murder rate in Medellin is lower than in Chicago and a lot of American cities, because these razones that sit at the top, these mafia-like organizations, are helping to prevent conflict and to assist in collusion. They're also capturing a lot of the rents from monopoly drug pricing. And so they're well paid for it. And the combos are pretty well paid, but they're actually generally, they're not super rich, because a lot of those monopoly rents are being captured by the Raison, which has the disproportionate power. But they're not. But their choice as to whether or not they govern is almost always in like an autonomous choice by the combo. There's one raison that's vertically integrated its combos, so it's one big firm, and they all govern the same way. But that's really just the one case. Okay, thank you very much. Happy to take questions by email or otherwise. Much appreciated.
Okay, so this is a joint project with Dominic and Couttenier, who is now a postdoc in Zurich. And as the title says, we are looking at conflict that could emerge due to specific positions and strategies that relate to how the network of pipelines is actually displaced. So let me, okay. So here is the motivation of the talk. So first of all, we have been working together on many projects on the importance of natural resources for conflict, and there have been papers, of course, related to interstate or related to civil conflict. And most papers, when they talk about natural resources and in particular fossil fuels, they put together oil and gas, right? So oftentimes the variable that people look at is in fact including both oil and gas trade. Now, it so happened that they are very different, the two markets, because oil can be easily transported by tankers. The difference in cost is not that much between pipeline and tankers, whereas when it comes to natural gas, it's way cheaper to go by pipelines. And in fact, the estimation is that the last we saw was that it's definitely cheaper for up to 8,000 kilometers distance. So clearly for half that distance or 1/4 that distance is the difference in cost is huge. And that's why you see that 80% of trade of gas actually happens through the pipeline. Therefore, when one, if one asks, could the network, the pipeline network, matter for the way in which natural resources affect conflict incentives, the answer should be that probably or possibly this would be the case for gas, but not for oil. And so it's kind of surprising that the two markets have not been studied so far separately, and that's what we do. And we focus in particular on gas, of course, given that on oil we have other papers to relate to, and in the handbook chapter, then Dominic and I are going to write for the Handbook of Economics of Conflict. Of course, this will be one important element, how the two markets can come together in an overall picture. Okay, so in this paper, what do we do? So first of all, we had to construct a data set about all the evolution of the pipeline network over time from 1960 to 2018. And what we do that then is to check whether indeed the position in the network matters in terms of the attractiveness of a country, of a node in the network for potential attacks or disputes. And what we do then is not only to show that indeed it seems to be the case that the locations with higher centrality in the network are more often subject to disputes, but we also showed how this incentive can be magnified by when prices, gas prices are high, and because the effects, the importance of the central position in terms of volumes becomes, of course, multiplied by a higher factor when the prices are high. And what we show is that indeed shocks to prices are increasing significantly the risk of conflict compared to the baseline. And what we then show is that this type of conflict incentives emerging for the positioning on the gas market complement well with the other type of logic that we uncovered in the QJE paper with Francesco Caselli related to the asymmetry of endowments. So the two effects are actually both present, and they basically, you know, increase the explanatory power of our approach. And so the final thing we do in the paper is use the methodology to actually elaborate some simulations that could allow us to evaluate situations in general, like, you know, what are the effects of densifications of the network, what are the effects of different projects to additions, in terms of additions to the pipeline that are currently being debated, and can this type of approach actually explain why different countries are actually supporting one project or another, and are taking sides in conflicts like the one in Libya, for example. And finally, we can also say something with some, you know, again, simulations of the model and data we have about what are the effects of global shocks like COVID-19, which in this case actually gives us a sort of silver lining to the annus horribilis we are living, in the sense that once you have a reduction in prices based, you know, due to a reduction of supply and demand at the same time, you can actually have a reduction of the incentives to disrupt the network. And so, you know, lower conflict could be the silver lining of today. So I'll skip the literature and then we can discuss connections that I came up even this morning when thinking about it, but if there is time, so let's skip that. So the data sources are basically two sets. So on the one hand, we had to construct this you know, pipeline network new data set, looking at the World Energy Atlas, news websites on energy, and, you know, from various sources related to the big companies, and of course using data from at least two sources for robustness in terms of the prices, IMF and Rehab. And then for the conflict, we use the standard militarized interstate disputes with, you know, running from 1 to 5 in terms of intensity. And as it is standard, the regressions are going to be done for level 3 and 4 because they are very too few words. And then, of course, you know, one could discuss what other measures of you know, interstate like sanctions, for example, one could use in future extensions. So those are the types of data we put together. And now, given that the correlates for war ends in 2010, the available part, and given that the biggest change in how the pipeline looks like connected with countries was basically 93 with the Federation, you know, Constitution of Russia. We restrict the sample to 94 to 2010. Okay. Okay, so this is the intuition I want to give you before going to the data about why centrality matters a lot for the attractiveness of a country. So we are still thinking country by country here, right? So the simplest initial example is, you know, right now Ukraine, for example, is still earning a large markup, and clearly this is like, you know, what people, one of the major reasons why the Nord Stream 2 is very much discussed is because the Nord Stream 2 addition, like bypassing basically Ukraine, will reduce the centrality of Ukraine, and this will have various consequences, and has been perhaps one of the causes of that dispute and related disputes. So this is just as an example, but in general, it's quite natural to think that the more central a node is, the more bargaining power we'll have in terms of you know, the long chain of passages that gas has to make from initial producers to final consumers. And so we use as a measure among the various measures of centrality the betweenness centrality measure, because basically that counts for every node, the fraction of the shortest path between any two players, a consumer and a producer, divided by the total number of short paths between such players. So basically, the idea is that if even if you fix the price, then basically having a high betweenness centrality, you can think of that as having a direct implications for the volume of trade, because in any pair between a buyer and a seller, they're always going to pick in their writing contracts the shortest path. And so if a node is on a large number of shortest path, that node is going to get a lot of volume. So even for a given amount of price, that given that revenues is price times quantities, you should expect large revenues for intermediaries that have that characteristic. Now, of course, then when it comes to modeling how exactly the profits are going to change with price and so on, one enters into the difficult territory of figuring out how the markup is determined in equilibrium, uniqueness of equilibria, Bertrand versus Cournot. So all that I'm going to skip. Okay. So, but clearly the intuition already is there with the volumes. Okay. So this is the picture of how the pipeline network looks when looking at the pipelines that were already built in 93, 94. And so the dark blue dots are those that have a high betweenness centrality. The lighter the blue is, the lower centrality the nodes have, and the gray lines are basically the links. And now, of course, we have slides we have pictures in the paper also showing how this graph evolved in 2000, in 2010, etc., because obviously it became thicker. But since we are going to get for most of the analysis, we'll take the beginning of the sample network picture. This is the only one I'm going to show you given the short amount of time we have. Okay, so now so far I've described you more or less what is the status quo at the beginning of the period in terms of those positions of bargaining power, relative bargaining power between countries. And now just to quickly mention what type of strategies are we thinking about in terms of gaining betweenness centrality through conflict. You can think basically of two different types of strategies depending on whether the player that we are talking about or that we are zooming on is a player that is currently on the network vis-a-vis the cases in which a player is outside the network. And for these two cases, respectively, we call the incentives destroying versus merging. So if you are on the network, the motivation to attack a neighbor could simply be to destroy that node, because you're destroying the node of a competitor or absorbing that node. You are definitely increasing it between the centrality if that competitor was already absorbing a lot of trade. Whereas if you are outside of the network, then the incentive is better labeled as merging, because you are currently outside. You're either buying or selling gas through tankers, which is much more expensive, and so on. So you have a net gain that comes from a different logic. Okay, so because there are two different logic, when we are going to do the explicit analysis of the dyadic on the dyadic data sets, we'll show the results with both these separate incentives and when do you put these incentives together. So the basic prediction for so we will test this prediction first on a monadic data set and then on a dyadic data set. So because the first intuition we wanted to get at is it gonna be true that just looking at country nodes, so at individual countries, when this node has a higher betweenness centrality, it's actually receiving more attention from neighbors or non-neighbors in terms of getting rid or conquering this node, right? And what we started to see then is we wanted to see first this without going directly to the regression model, just to see it graphically. So this is probably something that gives you an idea of the relevance of betweenness centrality, because here, this is an event study where in the sample period, you take all the times in which all countries, in which a specific country has experienced an increase in betweenness centrality, so for the creation of a new link in this sample period, and you call that time 0 for that particular country. Then you put them all together and you look at the difference between the risk of conflict before that BC change time and after, and you can see visually that indeed there seems to be something quite significant there. Okay, so in order to study this more explicitly, we use the empirical strategy that Dominic has already used in various papers. That is, eliminate to some extent the concerns for endogeneity of the betweenness centrality of a node by fixing the network of 1993 interacting with the price, and so with the usual country and time fixed effects to pick up the main effects other than the interaction, and looking at whether indeed the presumed fact that a higher price will make the betweenness the node with betweenness centrality even more attractive is something that we can then observe. Of course, because we are fixing the network at 93, 94 years, and we also did it for 97 for robustness check, then it's there is the sort of attenuation bias, but that's the methodology we're going to use. And finally, just the last bit of the in this presentation of the strategy, our preferred reduced sample is the one where we take out the major producers, 5 or 6, doesn't matter whether you take out the top 5 or top 6, because they are the ones that could have where a conflict in those places or even a dispute in those places could actually have an effect on the price. So here is what you see in the monadic regression. So you can see for the first two columns is the use of force. The third and fourth is on the more inclusive display of force category, and columns 1 and 3 are for the whole counting as a 1 every time there is an initiation of a dispute against any country. Sorry, display of force is 3 or more, level 3 or more out of 5. Now, what exactly the definition of display of force is in the correlates of war, I don't remember. It has to do with whether you move a ship to the border and shoot a few times, but maybe I don't remember if it also has a criterion with the number of deaths. Okay. Sorry. So, and in terms of the distinction between columns 1, 3 and columns 2, 4, the distinction there is that in columns 2 and 4 we only count an attack, so to speak, as a use of force or display of force by a country when it is towards a neighbor. Okay. So the reason of this distinction is that is that in this type of literature, many people, including ourselves in our QJE paper, we did reduce attention to conflict incentives among adjacent countries, and indeed, the fact that 2 and 4 here show a higher level of significance kind of confirm the idea that when moving to the dyadic data analysis, we should indeed go back to considering only the adjacent countries.
Massimo, 5 minutes left.
Okay, very good. So in the dyadic analysis, therefore, is motivated by that, and logically it follows the others, because we have shown first that in the event analysis that indeed BC seems to matter alone. At the level of country, we wanted to see whether indeed a change in the price makes that identified. And now in the dyadic effect, we want to study the mechanisms. So you want to go back to the idea that the incentives are, depending on whether you are outside or inside the network, are more in terms of merging or destroying, and we construct these 3 types of binary variables, dummy variables. So taking value 1 if you have a incentive, if you can maximize your BC by merging with one of your adjacent countries, or the second one, whether you max your BC by destroying one of the neighbors, and the third one, giving value 1 when at least one of the players in the dyad can max BC with any of these 2. Okay. And so this is the baseline specification now made explicit with the various measures of the 2 measures, use of force or display of force on the left hand side, as on the 2 different measures of the conflict variables, and now this on the independent variable is the dyad. Is this dummy about the one country in the dyad having the possibility to max BC with its action interact with the price. And now, of course, the fixed effects will be dyad fixed effects, okay? And the errors are clustered at the dyad level. Okay. So here you see, therefore, the corresponding table for the dyadic analysis to see whether this mirrors what we also got in the monadic analysis. And here, the analysis is a little bit more detailed because now, beside giving you columns for use of force and column for display of force, now that we are all in the dyadic set, we can distinguish the mechanisms. And so you can see that in almost all columns, all but the first one, this type of incentives, this type of strategic incentives to disrupt, whether they are merging or destroying, depending on who is the initiator, they're all significantly there. And of course, our preferred specification, where you consider both of them, are column 3 and 6, and indeed column 6 is shows quite strong results. So this slide shows you that indeed the results are not sensitive to the fact that we coded as one the case in which one of the 2 countries maximizes the BC among among attacking one of the adjacent countries. It could also you could also get strong results if you look at all cases in which gains of BC are above the median. And in fact, we have also other results in the robustness results about any gains, not just above median. And then we have results also adding back the producers. So the results obviously become a little bit weaker when you also include the producers, because the producers are targeted even for reasons beyond their centrality in the network, and therefore the distinctions among them is not all about between centrality. But you know, now I don't show them, but we have them. Now, before concluding, let me tell you what the other important thing for us, given that Dominic and I with Francesco also produced this result about asymmetry in the QJE paper. We wanted to check how the result is modified when we add the variable that is corresponding to the one that we had in the 2015 QJE paper. That is including now also a variable that, you know, it's an indicator variable that takes value 1 when in the pair, in the dyad, at least one of them has a gas reserve above median and the other one does not. So there is an asymmetry where, you know, at least one of them has a lot of gas above median and the other one does not. So this is one of the types of asymmetries we study in that paper. And what we see is that happily, the between the centrality interacted with price result remains pretty much the same. But on top of that, you get significant coefficient also for the variable that we you know, introduced with the model and conceptually in the 2015 papers, which means that, you know, the channel we study in this paper is an add-on, is an important add-on, and it complements the other channel. It doesn't, you know, they don't obstacle each other. So just to say with an example before the conclusion, why on top of this, you know, econometric result we think that is relevant in substantively what we are doing is that, so in international relations, there are oil asymmetry wasn't going, for example, very far for us in terms of, for example, understanding why Iran-Iraq would go to war, because Iran-Iraq, in terms of, you know, oil endowments and probably also gas endowments, they're quite symmetric. But if you look at this picture, you see that in terms of the networks of gas, the link or the potential link between Iran and Iraq, or the potential merger of the two links, has actually an incredible value added, right? The incentives to merge both for Iran and for Iraq are actually a max BC type incentive there. And so it's quite interesting that even in the sample period we have, because the Iran-Iraq full-blown war is before our sample period. So in the period we have from 94 to 2010, 2008 is actually the year with highest price, and in that year is where the interstate disputes actually spike. So this kind of tells us kind of an anecdotal evidence that this type of thing is a really important addition in our view. Now I don't show you the simulation because we don't have time, but basically what we show in the paper is that, you know, for example, for the Libyan conflict, we can easily use our model to show just using the positioning on the natural gas network why you know, Turkey was on the El-Sarraj side and Egypt, France, Russia were on the Haftar side. That's because on the exploitation of the gas reserve around the Cyprus island, where basically El-Sarraj had pledged to kind of side with Turkey on letting all that resources in the future go to the TANAP pipeline. So that thing would actually reduce the centrality of the opponents and vice versa. Okay, but this is the conclusion, and so I stop here.
So thanks a lot, Massimo, for the presentation. So if there is some question, you can raise your hand and I'll call you. Yes, Anis.
Very quickly, I think it's an amazing project, amazing dyadic data, this network data, and you know, you winged a little bit this question of like, can't you model it really? Can't you really model the rents that people are gaining, right? So betweenness, I'm not really sure why you would use that measure of betweenness. I think it would be really nice to have it like more motivated by the theory of what the measure is that you really want to use and how the market also works for transport of oil through these pipelines. And just like, for example, isn't it true that you can charge a lot higher price when there's no alternative? Is that what Betweenus measures, or is that
no? So Betweenus captures, you know, the fact that a node is on a large share of shortest paths, right? So it just focuses on the network. Now, one thing that we could do in the future, I don't know if in this project or in others, is to introduce somehow the heterogeneity of outside options. Because, for example, in the attempts I've made so far to do the model of these things, it's quite clear that that the price effect on the intermediaries depends on what is the outside option for final consumers. So, for example, suppose that you have, let's say, one intermediary for simplicity, and you have two final consumers. But now one final consumer has a deep water point that we were discussing in a previous presentation, and maybe has already a regasification plant and so on. And so for that final consumer one, let's say, the outside option of buying through tankers, buying liquefied gas, especially now that maybe the technology has changed and so on, is such that you cannot really charge too much more because it comes from the pipeline. So the markup could be lower on that final consumer with respect to another final consumer that does not have access to, does not have a deep water port, or does not have regasification plants, or for whom the fixed cost of those things are more expensive and so on. So at least in the short run has a very low outside option, and in that case, the markup on that trajectory is much higher. So this could create an additional level of heterogeneity depending on the location of the intermediary on the network, whether you're closer to F1 or to F2. But the problem is that how to capture this thing into a unique measure is still beyond my grasp.
I think that we have two more questions, one from Chris and then Maria.
Thanks so much. So one thing that I think a lot of these papers suffer from is that they're not very Coasian. And what I like about this paper, and I have an idea about how to push it forward, is you could make it more so. So these sorts of resource shocks, price shocks lead to conflict, sort of forget that, often omit the idea that in theory, maybe 9 times out of 10, that shouldn't result in war because there's some ability to pay off the other side, there's some transfer. And they overlook that. And so I think this is even true of your paper with Caselli, the earlier one, where there's like a little trick in the model where you kind of assume there's no bargaining space over the rents. I don't remember the details, but and so what's unsaid here is like, what's the Coasian breakdown that means they can't transfer. And so part one of like my question is just, I think it'd be great if you could articulate what it is about these shocks that make it hard to transfer. But part two is that you have this amazing measure, this display of force. So this is in some sense like the most Coasian conflict regression I've seen in a long time, where you actually have some data on efforts by the other country to signal strength and to overcome, and basically to find a bargain solution and get a transfer. So I think you could do a lot more. I didn't know about this data set. There's a lot of stuff in here. So I think you could do a lot more with the display of force data, or not display of force, like whatever the stuff is. But I think you could do a lot more at some of the patterns. It would be really interesting to explore and to talk about this not as like an oil shocks and conflict, but like an oil shocks and transfers and sometimes conflict paper. And especially if you could, I don't know if there's also data on actual transfers or on trade concessions or on arming. Like you should, this is what the classic models all show, right? Like basic military spending. You probably are going to see a much more robust, larger effect on these things. And then conflict is like one, I don't know, is it 5 in 10 times, 1 in 10 times, 1 in 100 times? I think that'd just be a lot more rich and important for the literature that forgets this.
I mean, it's clear, you know, that after World War II, we are talking about much more rare interstate wars. Of course, that's why, and it's clear that interstate disputes could be a signal of, in fact, the beginning of a sort of displaying strength in order to bargain. And so it's clear that we are looking at display award makes you look at the beginning, perhaps, of the impetus towards that obtaining transfers and so on. And you don't see the end. Maybe other outcome variables that we could discuss in the future could also tell us how successful in this challenge they are in terms of this transfers thing that you are mentioning. I don't know exactly what the variable to look at would be because you know the prices of gas, especially if you think about the merging incentive, it's from someone outside the network. So it would, whereas the sort of threat to destroy is from another competitor. So there you might see potentially adjustments or attempts to of collusion on the price or things like that. When it's from somebody outside the network, I would have to think about how to get to an outcome variable of the potential bargain.
I guess we have few minutes left, but short question and answer for Maria.
Yeah, so just a couple of things. One, conceptually, it seems that you should observe not only increase in this demonstration of power, but also maybe in diplomatic contacts, and efforts, because if these countries, they have problem that could be solved, perhaps the first best solution is to solve it through some other means. If you can get this data, I think it would be amazing.
Yes, but by the way, I'm not, my conjecture is that you could see actually more also on sanctions. So not all the effects are going to be in more investments in diplomacy, but could be part of the display of force could actually be more sanctions. And so that could actually delay the bargaining, and maybe you wouldn't see it right away. So I still have, there is literature in international relations about this.
I think it would be amazing if you can combine your methodology with these other measures which don't involve conflict. And just technically, if you can, this between the centrality probably is correlated with many things, even back in 1993, for example, the size of the country or how many countries a given country has borders with, this sort of things. So you can control for interaction of all these measures with your price. I don't know, maybe you already do this.
Yeah, no, this is something we can do. Mm-hmm.
Thanks a lot, Massimo. Thanks for the questions. So thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm very pleased to present this very preliminary work with Nathalie Monet and Lavinia Piemontese on the economic cost of conflict. So given the audience today, I think I do not have to come back too much on how conflicts, besides tragic humanitarian effects, adversely affect aggregate economic outcomes. So conflicts affect differently many different actors, some instance states with deterioration of means of carrying out its missions. There are also some deep impact on individual level and individual behavior through trust, social cohesion, health, education, or inequalities, but also some global spillovers with contagious to neighborhood countries. It has some disruptive effect on international trade or in capital flows. But also the fourth actor that is basically the one we are looking for in this paper is firms. And firms activity is very important for long-run growth and prosperity. And this is linked to some of the presentation we have seen today about, how to understand also the vicious cycles of violence. And we know that allocation of resources across firms is also crucial determinants of aggregate productivity. And then the welfare implication of this resource misallocation can be sizable. Okay, if we refer to the work of Einstein and Klino, they estimate aggregate productivity to increase from allocation around 50% in China or in India. And so in this paper, we make a crucial distinction between a direct exposure and indirect exposure. Direct exposure meaning that firm activity take place in areas that are basically areas where there is violent events. And indirect exposure, this is for firms that are outside of the violent zone, so still in a country involved in episode of violence, but not directly involved in violent zones. So, and there is a relatively scarce but very recent literature that show how firm activity is impacted by direct exposure to violence, and it goes through different mechanisms. And just to mention a few, it goes through labor supply, upstream access to inputs, cost of protections, also have some influence on the firm locations, on investment decisions, but also on public valuations of companies. So here we have 2 or 3 main questions in the paper, but the first one is, what are the economic costs for firms that are not producing in areas affected by violence? Okay, meaning here the indirect exposure. And how does it translate in terms of output loss, and through which mechanisms firms can be affected by a conflict elsewhere in the country? Okay, so in this paper we precisely ask whether and how the production network is the first order determinant of the propagation of conflict to firms outside of the conflict zone. And here we consider the production network as given by the bundle of input. So let me give you some intuition on this definition of the production network. So we have 3 main assumptions. The first one is that the production requires a bundle of inputs. The second assumption is that firms are facing a set of potential suppliers, and they have to select, and they select the most cost-effective suppliers. The third assumption is that firms are more likely to select a supplier with a lower price, depending, of course, on the idiosyncratic productivity of supplier and the efficiency of the supplier. And then the second determinants of the price is, of course, the trade cost between the buyer, and the supplier. But now let's imagine that there is an exogenous shock, or in our case, a conflict in the supplier location or regions or districts. It leads to an increase of the output price for suppliers located in the affected locations. And it could go through different mechanisms. I already mentioned 2 of them, but it could go through destruction of infrastructures, like road or railway destructions that may impact an increase of trade costs. But it could go also through insurance costs, security or protection costs, and something that I will mention later on, given the data we use, about extortion. But now, for a firm, even if the firm is located in a peaceful location, under the assumption of the selection of the most cost-effective suppliers, conflicts in supplier location leads to 3 main possibilities for this firm. So firm can decide still to buy inputs from the supplier, the same supplier that is directly affected by the conflict, but has to pay an extra cost. The second option is that for firms is to still buy the same input, but from another supplier in a peaceful district. But of course, you have some extra cost linked to the adjustment cost or some extra trade costs. And if there is no other supplier for the given input, the firm has to change its type of input. So at the end, whatever the different possibilities, even if the firm is not located in an area affected by conflict, the conflict in the supplier location will translate to an increase in the price of the bundle of inputs, through the production network. So what we do in this paper is that we have a look, we explore the mechanisms through which individual shocks have aggregate effect, and we quantify, thanks to the model, the indirect cost of violence. There is two main ingredients in the theory and also in the structural estimates. The first one is that we consider the idiosyncratic distortion that depends on conflict, that we consider as given for now in our model, and that vary over different districts. The second key ingredient of the model is that the propagation of the shock due to the conflicts depends on the firm-specific bundles of input that define the production network. So our theory builds on both the paper of Ansi and Clino 2009 and Acemoglu, Carvalho, Osdaglar, and Tabas-Salehi in 2012 that allow to measure and to identify both the direct exposure and the indirect exposure where conflict affects firm level outcome and then propagates through the production network. And for the aim of the structural estimate and also the reduced form analysis, we make use of very rich data on manufacturing plants in India from 2000 to 2008, and I will give you more information on data and how these detailed information are very rich and allow to make use and to test the different prediction of the model. So just first, I would like to give you the 2 or 3 main features that I guess makes the Maoist insurgency relatively suitable for our question. First, the Maoist insurgency, while of course deadly, it remains relatively low intensity warfare, meaning that in many districts where Maoist insurgency has an activity, we observe a joint presence of economic activities through manufacturing industries and also the existence of the armed. The second key features of this Maoist insurgency is that there is, over our period of interest from 2000 to 2008, a geographical expansion of the presence of the Maoist group, meaning that in 2000 there is 33 different districts across 8 states, but in 2008 we have around 70 districts across 11 states. And then the last feature that makes Maoist insurgency suitable for that question is that there is a lot of narratives, there is a lot of reports and also academic papers that mention that a part of the Maoist activity relies on the extortion of the local economy activities, especially through the recurrent payment of a tax, meaning protection for money or direct attacks on firms' assets. And also in terms of targets, it ranges from individual businesses to large industries, but also to private and public companies. So we make use of UCDP pure data set, which is relatively common, that give us some information on the daily and geolocalized information of violent events, and over our period of 2000 to 2008, there it represents something like a bit more than 7,000 different events. So here it's just to give you over our period where we're located in the Maoist groups, and especially, which is here an interesting feature, it was relatively widespread across the country, and especially on what is called the Red Corridor. And for the purpose of our analysis, this is something that is relatively interesting. So now, at the data, which is at the heart of our analysis, we make use of the India's annual survey of industries, for which we have data from 2000 to 2008. It represents something like 15 to 45K establishment per year. Which is interesting is that we observe we have the universe of establishments with more than 100 employees, and for establishments between 10 to 99 employees, we have a representative sample every year, meaning that we have 20% of the universe of the firms with this size. So, and we have two crucial information. The first one is that for each firms, we have the information about the nature of the 10 most important inputs for the production. Okay, and here we have information about the 10 most important inputs at the 5-digit level, but also for the outputs. The second crucial information is that we have some GPS location at the district level, meaning that we are able to say that where the firm activity is taking place over the different districts in India. So just to give a little bit of sense of the data we have, so at the end, since we keep only firms that are surveyed at least twice, we have a little bit more than 66K design firms from 2000 to 2008, over 544 districts. 70 districts are affected by the conflict in 2008, and it represents around 7% of firms that are located in these affected districts. 1/3 of the sample is within a radius of 200 kilometers when we look at conflict-affected districts. And then, and I'll show you in some counterfactual analysis that there is 90 different districts that are, neighboring district of conflict-affected district. So now, before to give you a little bit of more insights about the model, I would like to show you some suggestive evidence. So here, the first suggestive evidence is to estimate the impact of conflict on the output price of a given firm in a given district and in a given year. Okay, so here we have the log of the price that is explained by conflict. So here it's very broad, it's very simple measure of conflict, just a dummy taking value 1 if there is at least one event linked to the Maoist activity in the district in the given year. We have a set of log firm characteristics like wages, interest rate, input prices, but also the firm level productivity. And we have an alternative. We have fixed effect, and at the time of the presentation of the estimate, I'll show you the different level of fixed effect. And we have a two-way clustering at the industry state and district year level. Okay, so here is the first table for the estimate. So in the first column, we just introduce the state year fixed effect, meaning that here the comparison is across districts within the same state and same year, and where some districts are affected by conflict and some are not. And here we have a positive correlation between firms, okay, of firms that are affected and that have the activity in district affected areas. In column 2, we introduce the district fixed effect in order to control for all time invariant or unobserved district characteristics. And in column 3, we add a more demanding, specification because we include a fixed effect that is an industry cross state cross year fixed effect, meaning here that the comparison is really between firms from the same industry and state in a given year, but that are located in two different districts, one affected and the other is not affected. And even demanding, we still find a positive and significant correlation. Okay, so aware of the fact that when we use this data on price, we may have some measurement issue. We have a result. We have some results that are relatively similar when we use the revenue productivity instead of the log of price following the proxy method of Woolridge in 2009. So now, following what was said in Clino 2009, where they mentioned that we may expect idiosyncratic distortion to affect the dispersion of the TFP, okay, the level productivity, the value of the level productivity. We collapse our information we have at the firm level, we collapse the information at the industry, district, and year level, and we compute the dispersion at this unit of observation of the TFPR, okay? And here again, from column 1, column 2, it's just a matter of the level of the fixed effect. When we find that industry and district year where there is some conflict, we observe a larger dispersion in terms of a log TFPR. Okay. So now, of course, for the sake of time, I can't spend too much time explaining the model, but I just want to give you the essence and also the main ingredients of the model. So this is a standard static model of monopolistic competitions among heterogeneous producers. Firms produce for the consumption of goods for representative consumers and goods that are used by other firms as intermediate inputs. Okay, so firm I uses a constant return to scale Cobb-Douglas technology using capital, labor, and of course, this is the aim of the paper, intermediate goods as inputs. And so the production function is given by the equation 1, where Y is equal to the firm level productivity, capital, labor, and the firm's intermediate good basket that is a Cobb-Douglas composite. Okay, so here, which is important is in these intermediates good baskets Cobb-Douglas composite is that there is all the potential inputs that is mentioned by X J high, that is the amount that firm I purchases from firm J, but it's raised at the power of omega Ji, which is the share of the good J in the total intermediate input use of firm I. Okay, and this omega is very important, meaning that it's the way, you know, the shocks for firms percolates to the whole of the economy. So let me just give you an illustration of the intuition why a firm affected by the conflict, the shock will percolate through the production network. So, okay, here, if the firm J uses firm I output in its input bundles, I rewrite here the production function of firm J that depends on the log level of firm level productivity, capital, and labor, but more important, it depends of the bundle of input. So in red, here we have the production, the amount of the production by firm I that is used by J for the productions, and omega Ij is the share of good I in the total intermediate input use of firm J. Okay, so here, if there is some distortion, direct exposure suffered by firm I because of the conflict, it will affect firm J's output, which will decrease by a proportion of 1 minus alpha omega Ij, the production of the firm J. So here, this is only the first order effect, okay, meaning that the increase in firm I output price because of conflict, the direct effect, will lead firm J, which has the output of firm I in its input bundle, to cut its demand for it, reducing its own output. Okay? So now it's not the end of the adjustment. Okay, it's not the end of the story, because firms that have firm J's output in their input bundles will be also subject to a second order effect of the distortion of firms I's output. Okay, and so if we continue until the end order, we obtain the total impact from the distortion suffered by firm I initially, because the firm I is located and have this firm activity in the district affected areas. And if we continue in this fashion, we define something that is exactly the same that in Acemoglu at this quarter in 2012, the influence vector that represents the spillover effect along the line of the production network. And here, the nth element of these influence vectors contains all the cumulative effects that a shock to firm N has on the remaining firms of the economy. Okay, meaning that the weight of every firm is exactly the same than what was mentioned by Massimo about the centrality. Okay, and the higher is the centrality of a firm in a conflict district, the higher is the impact of its loss on the aggregate output. So now the model gives us three main predictions. I already spoke about the two first ones, the suggestive evidence, but the first proposition, the proposition 1A, is that in a competitive equilibrium, output distortion due to conflict yield to an increase of the output price. The proposition 1B is that in a competitive equilibrium, output distortion due to conflict lead to an increase of the dispersion of TFPR. Okay, TFPR meaning the value of the firm level productivity. Okay, so then we have the second proposition that characterizes the structure of the equilibrium. And then in the competitive equilibrium, the log aggregate output is given by the influence vector that I just mentioned. we have also epsilon, that is a vector of the firm level productivity weighted by some idiosyncratic distortion coming from the conflict, and mu, which is a constant that is independent of the vector epsilon. Okay. So now, when we bring the data to the model, we are first able to characterize and to compute the output loss in conflict district. So we measure the output loss suffered by firms located in conflict using a GMM by deriving moment condition from the prediction from the model. Okay, so then we have different way to match the standard deviation, but here I'll show you just one specific case where we match the standard deviation of the log TFPR for every state here. And thanks to this strategy, we are able to estimate the idiosyncratic distortion that is due to conflict, that is 0.11, okay? So critical 0.11. So then, equipped with this measure of idiosyncratic distortion, we are able to compute the aggregate output loss. And on average, the yearly output loss is around 0.7%. And this average yearly output loss exhibits some yearly variations. Okay, so meaning that the loss ranges from 0.27 in 2000 and a little bit more than 1% in 2007 when conflict was a little bit higher. But it exhibits also some very striking spatial variations that are imputed to the network production. So here you have a map, a visual representation where there is a different quantile of districts that are affected in terms of loss. And what we observe is that almost all districts, if you remember that the red corridor were much more, on the southwest part of the country, but we observe that districts that were not affected directly by the conflict, we still have some output loss. Okay, so now, as I said in the introductions, one interesting aspect of this production network is to be able to estimate the overall loss due to the conflict, but also to disentangle between the contribution of the direct exposure to the indirect exposure to the conflict. Okay, so now if we come back to the structural estimates, firms that are directly exposed to the conflict suffer a loss of 11% of their income. Okay, this is the tau that I already talked about. And this 11% of loss of the income for firms that are located in district with a conflict, it translates into an aggregate loss for the world economy around 0.14%. Okay, but now if we take into account the production network, if we take into account this indirect exposure, the effect to the production network, as I said, is 0.69%. Okay, so meaning that on average, the direct exposure to conflict accounts only for 20% of the aggregated loss, and the remaining 80% of this loss can be explained by the indirect exposure to conflict. Okay, so the counterfactual analysis is still in progress, so it's still a very preliminary paper, but I just would like to put some highlight onto a different exercise. So the first one is, okay, what would be the cost for the economy if there is a spread of the conflict across on different districts? So here we consider as a baseline the year 2008, where the total loss is 0.91%. So we simulate the output loss. Okay, if firms that are located in the neighboring districts in 2008 to districts that are affected by conflict, meaning it represents 90 different more affected districts, we compute that the aggregate yearly output loss will be 2.53%, meaning 3 times larger than the one we observe. Okay, so here we have a kind of estimation on what will be the cost of the diffusion and the spread of the conflict to the adjacent districts. The second counterfactual analysis we have for now is to say, okay, so based on the information we have of the network, we're able to identify the key player, okay, and then what would be the effect if a policy helps to protect firms in the top of the distribution of centrality? Okay, so we consider here the 10% more central firms in district affected area for year 2008, and we have the exercise that we mute the direct exposure, meaning that the idiosyncratic distortion due to conflict is 0 for the 10% most central firms. And what we observe is that the aggregate yearly output loss will be 0.63, meaning that it dropped almost by half of the total output loss that we observe. And in the,
Hi, Mathieu. Sorry to interrupt. I'm just wanting to make you aware of the time.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Just to before to conclude is that when we look at the more central firms, we simulate what would be the loss if we drop from the network these more central firms. Okay, it's that if we isolate completely like a lockdown this district. And here you have the distribution of the GDP loss that will be affected if we drop one by one the most important firms in the network that are to the located in the district affected areas. Okay, so in conclusions, I guess the paper echoes the call of Dominic and Matthias in a new paper in 2020, where they said that a better understanding of this channel of transmission linking war to development slowdown is something that is important and aiming especially to guide the policy measures. And then I hope that our model goes a bit in that direction. Thanks a lot.
Very fascinating. Of course, I'm a big fan of this kind of thing. My question is kind of threefold, right? So the first one is, how do you know the other firms are not affected? Like, how do you know that the neighboring districts are not suffering, risk perceptions and maybe similar? I mean, how do you know people there travel freely and delivery is not affected? Depends, of course, on the size of this. And my second question is also to make it a bit broader, given that you have a structural model and you're not necessarily relying really on a very clean identification strategy in the sense of we really need, or maybe you have exogenous shocks and conflict. I was wondering, do you need to pin everything on these input chains? Can't you also check, for example, what happens to wages? Do wages go up with conflict, or do they go down with conflict? Or because you control for wages, but I guess that it would be really interesting to look at this in a more holistic way and actually look at everything together and say, look, maybe these 0.7% is really a lower bound, and actually, if you would put on other things that happen at the same time, it's bigger or it's smaller, or I think you're throwing away also stuff with the fixed effects, I guess, and I'm sometimes skeptical with regard to I think we should need to think about are we absorbing variation that is actually useful and actually meaningful when we do these fixed effects, especially when you do structural models. I think that one can quickly overdo fixed effects, and so I also wanted to know about your reaction to whether you tried out other things.
Thanks a lot, Anes, for your comments. On the first one, for now, we do not consider what will be the effect, for firms that are located not in the affected areas, but just close to. So this is definitely something that we have in the top of our agenda, and that's why we think that it's definitely probably a lower bound that we are able to capture. At the same time, that's something that I guess for us is also important, is that the nature of the conflict is also a little bit different across the different districts, meaning that, you may have, even if you have 10 events during a year, okay, in terms of intensity, where it's located in the district is definitely not the same. It's a wide spread across the district, or if the 10 events are just, in a city or a very given a specific location in a district. So we have definitely, that's very preliminary. We have a lot of things to do on our agenda, but the one working more, on this definition of conflict and how it may have an effect is definitely something that I guess we are going deeper, and the point raised is, I guess, in that direction. And in regard to structural model and the suggestive evidence, so it shows that for now, for the suggestive evidence, it's just correlation. There is potentially many endogeneity issue. We try to solve a part with a fixed effect that absorb a lot of variation and probably also part of the story. But when we refer to the structural estimate, for now, that's true, we do not allow, these idiosyncratic shocks to have an impact on capital or labor. It's only on the total value of the production. So it was for the sake of simplicity, at least for the first draft of the model, having just one specific distortion on the total output value, but definitively, and based also on the literature, it's relatively clear that we may also try to go deeper on, okay, affect, I don't know, capital, labor, wages, and something like that. And from the literature I've cited in the introduction, it's relatively clear that direct exposure could be explained by many different channels that for now we are not able to fully encompass in our structural model.
Thanks for the really interesting paper. I was wondering whether you've thought about looking into potentially positive effects on competing firms that produce similar products, but in areas not affected by conflict, and then upstream and downstream benefits also for their suppliers and so on. Because what you're measuring is kind of the net, but there could be distributional impacts that you can.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I guess you're totally right. For now, so this is a static model, so the network is given, and for sure we do not capture and we are not able, to measure the heterogeneity you mentioned, and some positive you may have, especially I guess in kind of reshuffling on the link across the buyers and the sellers. So it's also for the model we have to for sure to try to integrate, because we are also convinced, and based on the last exercise we had, when you take some very key players and if you make them completely locked down, it has very strong effect on the total loss. So for sure you may have some compensation with other firms in terms, and probably similar firms in terms of the production of the input. But this is definitely something that we have to dig in, because I'm also convinced that there is something to understand in that case.
So this is joint work with Sandra Sequeira, Giorgio Chiavelli, and Stelios, and effectively, and we couldn't think of a better audience to present like this one. So effectively, this paper will be about forced displacement. And if I was to motivate the paper, actually not perhaps in this crowd, but more generally, we have something like 80 million forcibly displaced people nowadays. This is based on the United Nations Agency for the Refugees as of last year. And what I want to stress here is that this is a global problem. It's by no means a problem of Syria, which is in the news, perhaps, or Yemen. It's a global problem. And although there is a lot of research and a lot of interest, actually some by people who are in this meeting today, on the impact of refugees in advanced economies, for example, in Switzerland, Dominic has a great paper on that. Actually, most of refugees go to low-income and lower-middle-income countries or in fragile environments. So the bulk of refugees do not come, as my compatriots, the Greeks, believe, in the beautiful islands in the Aegean. Actually, they tend to flock, let's say, from the northern of Mozambique today to Tanzania. And if anything, the trend is worsening over time. Now, another feature which is quite interesting, and we will try to shed some light on in this research, is that we have various types of displacement trajectories. And we may watch a very nice documentary about, let's say, Syrian refugees in some refugee camp in Lebanon, or residing in some villages and communities in Turkey, or residing in some other areas in Lebanon. But we have a lot, actually, a plethora of displacement trajectories. We have, of course, internally displaced people who may flock the countryside and seek shelter in some town or big city, or they may seek shelter in some other more, quote unquote, peaceful region, or we can have refugees displaced typically in neighboring countries. So studying this issue is actually quite hard, because to start with, we do not have high quality data on displacement. there are actually a plethora of very interesting works, but effectively they are case studies. So we learn, of course, a lot from them, but it prevents from a generalization of those results. So what we will do is that we will focus in Mozambique. I will discuss shortly, briefly, its devastating history. And during the Mozambican civil war, which, as I mentioned, I will discuss shortly, we have close to 4 million displaced people, some internally displaced from the countryside to the big cities, some fleeing to nearby countries, some others fleeing in other rural places in Mozambique. We even have cases of forced displacement from urban centers to the countryside. And we will be using census data, which will allow us to advance on identification. I will show you today some within family specifications that will exploit the fact that during conflict, as we read in the news or know from research, we have big families actually where one kid, let's say, gets moved from one town to a city, another one in a rural place, another one perhaps in a nearby country. So we will have actually thousands of observations where different siblings were subject to 3 or even 4 different displacement trajectories. So in a nutshell, what are the results? We find very strong effects of displacement, positive effects on education. These are especially pronounced for displacement from the countryside to big cities, but also to smaller towns, even big villages. And we even find positive effects on human capital, even when displacement comes from a rural place in Mozambique to another rural place in Mozambique. Let me add a caveat here. Mozambique at the time, and still, is extremely rural, so you should think those as effectively peasants working mostly in subsistence agriculture. In contrast, we do not find much of a human capital effect of displacement and residents in refugee camps that the UN set at the time in Zimbabwe, or other types of displacement in nearby Malawi, South Africa, and Tanzania. Now, what we further show is that this increase, if you like, of education after displacement goes handy with some form of structural transformation, yet those peasants gradually move into services. At the time, and even today, manufacturing in Mozambique, as in most African countries, is actually tiny. Now, we explore heterogeneity, and one of the nice features of the data, which effectively is the census, is that we can dig into various aspects of heterogeneity. Effectively, our key result of heterogeneity is that who benefits even more? Those kids whose parents or grandparents were somewhat educated or they were speaking Portuguese, the colonial language. Who benefits more? Those, of course, who go to the big cities, but even those who go to rural places, where in these rural places, more people are educated and they are more commercial or trade oriented. So, and we will conclude the analysis. I hope I will have some time. We ran a survey in 2020 in Nampula, the biggest city in the north of the country, where we tried to see whether the effects that we document with the first census post-civil war persist. And actually we find that they do persist, the effects of education. But actually the survey, which of course is in a much smaller sample than the full census estimates that I will show you, suggests also some adverse effect of displacement, mostly on mental health. So everybody, I think, who is attending has contributed at least one super cool paper on this issue. Effectively, our paper is in between a very big research on forced displacement and refugees more generally. Effectively, our contribution here is look in a low-income, fragile environment where most of the refugees tend to go. So we believe that our paper will have something to say about what's happening today, of course, always subject to the external validity concerns. And of course, this is a conference about civil war. Many of you have contributed to this literature. I think nowadays we see more and more papers that are somehow trying to unbundle conflict, so examine specific elements of conflict. For example, there's a very cool paper by Felipe Casendo looking on bombardment, with Georgian studies who have a paper looking on landmines. There are papers by Chris on child soldiering. So perhaps we should start thinking more about unbundling conflict. So this is paper, if you like, fits on this research agenda. And of course, there's a more practical or more policy type of work. What are the best ways for the international community and countries to respond to conflict and refugee flows? And actually, our paper will also have something to say about childhood exposure effects, a literature that is receiving more and more attention thanks to the cool work of Chetty and Henren. With Alberto, we had some related work. This paper looks at regional effects during peaceful times. Actually, our evidence suggests that actually even displacement during conflict times could be associated with considerable regional childhood exposure effects. Quickly, let me give you the context. So we can discuss endlessly about the Mozambican civil war. Effectively, we have two main warring parties, Frelimo, which took power immediately after independence in 1975. In 1977, they declared the one-party socialist rule, and shortly afterwards, a civil war starts. Actually, Renamo, the rebel group, initially was backed by Ian Smith's apartheid regime in Rhodesia at the time. Then when Mugabe takes place, Renamo finds South Africa as its now backer. And actually, this is a very complex civil war with distinct phases, violence changing place. And if you are to remember one thing from the Mozambican civil war, is effectively this is a war on civilians. All of us, I guess, we have used the PRIO data. Actually, the Mozambican civil war is the conflict where you have the biggest share of one-sided violence against the civilian population. So effectively, Frelimo and Renamo rarely fight. Both parties, mostly Renamo, but also Frelimo and smaller militias and rebel groups, effectively attack the civilian population. Now, we have a lot of displacement during that conflict, both for reasons that are quote-unquote more well understood, but also because of some peculiarities of the Mozambican civil war. In the early phases of the war, we have a forced villagization scheme implemented by Zamora Marcel and his administration. So we have a lot of forced displacement by the administration. Then Renamo, when they come to control big swaths of the country, they split their territories into terror and forced labor zones. Also in the mid-80s, we had a lot of people moving out of the big cities into nearby to the big cities areas because of food shortages, and of course we had pervasive insecurity. Now, moving during the conflict was of course very challenging. First, there was a lot of violence, battles between the groups, one-sided violence, but also a lot of landmines and very limited transportation infrastructure. So this is just eyeballing Mozambique. For the Italians, I know there are many Italians here, it's something like 1.5 times the size of Italy, 7 times the size of Greece, something like 10 or 15 times the size of Switzerland. Only effectively 3 main railroads and something like 1 million landmines at the time, preventing people or making it very hard for people to plan where exactly they go and how they would move. So we will use for our analysis data from the census, and the census will record the first post-independent census was conducted in 1997, and it will record not only the residence of individuals in 1997, but also the residence at the end of the war in 1992, and also their birthplace. So this will allow us to have a displacement matrix, since we will be able to observe individuals' residence at birth, where they were at the end of the war, and where they are in 1997. We will be focusing on educational attainment and industry of employment, and of course we will use the census for a plethora of other variables that we will exploit in our heterogeneity analysis and for controls. We will use also many other types of data. So this is in a nutshell what happened in Mozambique in terms of forced displacement. So in the census, when we look at the full census, we have something like 11 million observations, something like 1 million of those were refugees, Close to 3 million have been internally displaced, so roughly speaking 4 million. And you can see those disaggregations. We can further split, for example, IDPs in those who were born in rural places. This would be most, because the share of employment in agriculture at the time was exceeding 90%. But as I mentioned before, we even have IDPs who were born as urban dwellers and they were forced, or they moved outside the cities. And I will be showing you regressions focusing on this age cohort, because we really want to focus on displacement during the war period. What is interesting is that the shares are almost identical in the full sample of 11 million people, or in the smaller sample of, roughly speaking, 5 million people that I will be showing you results. So what are the main categories? So the first main category are externally displaced. And as you can see, externally displaced mostly come, this is the place of birth, and this is where they are in 1997. They come mostly from border regions to Tanzania, to Malawi, to Zimbabwe, to Zambia, to South Africa. Now, we also have, and this is the breakdown, so something like 70% of those, roughly speaking, 1 million individuals went to Malawi, something like 60,000 to Zimbabwe. What is important here is that in Zimbabwe, most, if not all, of the refugees settled in UN-run camps. In Malawi, there was a hybrid model, both UN camps and Mozambicans settling into villages and informal settlements, and the rest were set where there was no UN camps at the time in South Africa or in Zambia and Brazil. Now, these are all various quotes about life in refugee camps, which is far from great. This is how a refugee camp looked at the time in Malawi, and what Sandra, my great co-author, who is doing very important work nowadays looking in refugee camps, she's telling me that refugee camps today are not that different from camps something like 4 decades ago. Now, looking now into IDPs, effectively we have two main categories: those who were displaced to urban areas and those who were displaced to other rural areas. And we can further split those who were IDPs rural to urban into those who went to the main cities, Maputo and the satellite city of Matola, Beira and Nampula. These are 3 cities by the Indian Ocean, and we have 10 other big cities and 81 smaller towns or big villages. This is the classification of the Mozambican Statistical Agency. And this is, if you like, the breakdown, rural to rural, and those are rural to urban IDPs. Of course, and this is what this graph aims to show, is that those who were living close to the big cities, and here you see the 3 big cities plus the 10 other ones, live close to those cities, not paradoxically. So let me start showing you some cross-sectional patterns and then try to say something more causal. Now, these are plain vanilla correlations. And please focus on specification 3 and specification 6 that include birth region fixed effects. So effectively the experiment here, these are not causal by no means, but the way we should think about those is, let's take 2 individuals who were born in the same birth region. Let's control for some observable individual features. And the baseline category here would be non-movers born in rural places. And what you see from the specification, the outcome variable here is an indicator that identifies those with some schooling. Actually, what you see is that those who went from the rural, from the countryside to the cities, they have something like 26 percentage points higher likelihood to attend and have some schooling. This is not small because at the time, the mean, if you like, in the control group, which here are those who did not move rural born, is very low, it's just 11%. And what is further interesting is that those that went from one rural place to another rural place, so this didn't go to a big city, even those tend to acquire more education. Again, these are not causal. I will discuss this more formally shortly. Now, as I mentioned before, we have also the reverse experiment. We have something like 60,000 individuals who were born in urban places and they moved to the countryside. Those actually, this is associated with a tax, if you like, on education in the sense that they have a much lower likelihood to acquire some schooling. I will not show you results. These are Poisson estimates using schooling years. And what is further interesting here is that these education differences map into employment differences. So those who go from the countryside to the cities, they are much less likely to work in agriculture, much more likely to work in services, and we find similar impact for rural to rural. So this is a summary of, if you like, the main descriptive patterns. Now, before I go to the more causal estimates, I think there is some interesting heterogeneity here. I will discuss heterogeneity more formally shortly, but there is some interesting results here. First, we can allow the coefficients to differ between those who experienced a refugee camp life to those that did not. Again, we do not observe the data whether they settled in the refugee camp, but reading about the displacement, almost everyone who settled in Zimbabwe settled in a refugee camp. In Malawi, we had a mixed model, and then in the other countries, we didn't have any refugee camps. There is no differences whatsoever. Again, I want to be very careful when we do a policy recommendation, but this challenges a bit this paradigm of, you know, the refugee camp model. Now, for those who move to urban places, we tend to find bigger effects for those who go to the big cities, the 3 big cities by the coast or the other 10 big cities. But even those who go to smaller towns or large villages, also they gain in terms of employment in services and also in terms of education. And perhaps what is the most interesting result, and let me just, so this, for example, is the effect when we look at displacement to the 81 big villages and small towns, the big cities and the top 10 towns, much bigger effects on education for those who move to big cities or to bigger towns. Now, what I want to stress though, is here you see specifications of the likelihood to work in agriculture or in services based on different displacement trajectories for those Mozambicans who do not have any education and for those who have some education. And what I want to stress here is that there is a much stronger effect, actually twice as large. So the structural transformation, if you like, correlation is twice as large for those who acquire education as compared to those who do not acquire education, suggesting that education and structural transformation go handy. This perhaps is not news to this crowd, given the big research on human capital and structural transformation, but now we see a link between civil war and IDPs and displacement with this mechanism, which, to the best of our knowledge, has not been much documented. Now, let me jump to what we can say more to establish causality. Now, we implement effectively 2.5 or 3 approaches. For brevity, I will show you within family specifications, which we believe account for many concerns that you might have and significantly advanced on identification. Now, effectively here you see how rich our experiment is. We have a lot of siblings. For example, let me just pick this number. So we have something like 10,000 households where one individual stayed, so he or she is a non-mover in the countryside, and then her brother or sister moved from the countryside to an urban place. We have something like 31.6 thousand individuals where the one brother and sister stayed in the countryside and the other one moved to another rural place. And we even have something like 15,000 individuals with households having 3 or more displacement trajectories. And this is because at the time, and still in Mozambique, we have big families with a lot of siblings. This is, if you like, the histogram illustrating the frequency of the observations. Now, the other point that this map tries to illustrate is that there's a very wide spatial distribution of split families. We observe them all across the country. So effectively, I will show you 4 household fixed effect specifications. One where I will add household fixed effects to the conditional, if you like, estimates. Then I will further add 5-year age brackets, so to compare brothers and sisters of roughly speaking the same age or the same gender. And then what we can further do is restrict estimation in twins. I think we'll have something like 13,000 twins, and conduct exactly the same analysis into twins. So our key result is that compared to the cross-sectional estimate, which I showed you before, accounting for family household characteristics is actually quite important, in line, I guess, with your prior and clearly with our prior. But still, what we get here is that the likelihood of some education of those IDPs who move from the countryside to the cities increases by something like 8%. And quite interestingly, even those who go from one rural place to another rural place also benefit more. And again, here the comparison is across siblings. So we're comparing individuals to their brothers and sisters of the same age and of the same gender. These are the evidence looking at agricultural employment. The result will be exactly the mirror image if I was to show you services with the opposite sign. Again, we see some movements out of agriculture associated with displacement. We even observe structural transformation for the externally displaced. Our interpretation is that although the externally displaced do not acquire more education, they get disconnected with land. So when they return back, they will not be farmers, then perhaps they will be engaged in commerce or some other form of service. So this, if you like, are the most restrictive specifications. We have something like 12,000 rural-born twins, and we get very similar estimates to the within family analysis in the twin sample. And likewise, we have something like almost 10,000 twins urban-born. Those that went, the one brother went to the countryside, perhaps due to the forced villagization project of Frelimo, or because of some other policy, actually this is associated with lower education. And this, if you like, is a summary, let me not read, of our results. What I want to stress here is that, so what should be the takeaway? So forced displacement, which is clearly not a good thing, let me be clear, and we will show that it's associated with significant cost in the survey, perhaps is useful in the sense that people acquire some education and some human capital. This is a bit consistent with the uprootedness hypothesis, and many of you have worked and have written papers on this issue. So what we find here, though, is the following. We tend to find that the uprootedness hypothesis also holds for IDPs, which perhaps is a new result. We do not find this effect for refugees, which effectively goes against earlier research, which of course is case specific. But what our analysis suggests is that perhaps there is too much heterogeneity. And one of the good things here is that we can use the full sample and shed light on heterogeneity. So let me just tell you now what effectively we do on this front. Now, effectively, we can think about heterogeneity in a three-layer framework. We can explore, and we do explore, heterogeneity at the individual level. So boys, girls, for example, firstborns, or even the intersection of the two. We also examine whether the individual moved together with one member of the older generation. Perhaps this has an effect. Then we can think about household characteristics, like whether the parents or the grandparents were educated, or household size, or whether the family lost some kids or relatives during the war. And of course, we can think about locality characteristics, proxies of regional development, of conflict intensity, or human capital. So these are the effects when we allow the coefficient to differ by gender. As you see, both for the refugees and for IDPs from rural to urban, and for the IDPs from rural to rural, bigger effects for boys versus girls. Now, here again, I'm showing you the results when we look on firstborn, bigger effects for the firstborn. Now, this to us is the most interesting result of heterogeneity, because here we allow the coefficient to differ for those families where the parents or the grandparents speak Portuguese or have attended school, let's call them educated, and those not much educated. And then when we compare refugees, much bigger effects, positive for education, for human capital, for the offsprings of families with some human capital. The same when we look at IDPs to the big cities or to the towns, even bigger gap when we look at IDPs from rural place to another rural place. Similar type of heterogeneity when we look at colonial road density or other proxies of development. And this is when we look at the human capital of the old generation at the destination region. Again, much higher effect, especially when we look rural to rural for those IDPs who move from one place without many schools and without a lot of educated elderly to another place where you have higher levels of human capital. Not much heterogeneity is similar effects when we look at conflict intensity actually with various ways. So what's the summary of heterogeneity? From a more, if you like, economics viewpoint, we think that the most interesting heterogeneity is that the effect is larger for those displaced who in their family, some of their grandparents or their parents either speak Portuguese or have attended school. We do not find heterogeneity in the sense that with respect to household size or with respect to whether the family lost some members during the conflict. And effectively, when we allow for heterogeneity across regions, we tend to find a similar type of result. Who benefits? Those who tend to go from one place to another place with a higher level of development, and actually from all the development proxies, human capital tends to be the one shifter of education the most. And everything I showed here is within family across sibling specification, so endogeneity concerns should be muted. Now, in an effort to shed further light on those results, recall our censuses come from 1997, which is interesting because the 1997 census recorded the trajectory of Mozambicans during the war, but Mozambicans did not do so in the 2017 and the 2007 census. So Sandra Sequeira did a super cool survey that she administrated in Nampula. Nampula is the biggest city in the north of the country. Its population doubled during the conflict because a lot of people from the countryside flocked to the city effectively to seek protection. So the most interesting, at least in our view, result is first, those who came from the countryside and those who are urban dwellers who were born in the city, they have very similar attitudes regarding the importance of education. Those who flock to Nampula from the countryside, when we compare them to their brothers and siblings who stayed behind, they have higher levels of education. So this, if you like, is the long run analog to the specifications I showed you before, with a caveat here that the sample is 1,000, while before the sample was like 7 million or so. But these are within family specifications comparing an IDP who fled from the countryside during the war to Nampula compared to his or her brother and sister who stayed behind in the countryside. When we do the comparison of movers to Nampula to those who were born and raised in Nampula, no difference whatsoever, which suggests that the countryside, the peasants with the urban dwellers, their human capital converges very quickly, which we think is a very positive, if you like, effect. Did wages converge? Almost. So there is a small gap in the sense that those who were born in the city and raised in the city earn somewhat higher wages as compared to IDPs who fled to Nampula during the war. And then we examine, so we asked various questions on things that, economists and I guess everybody in this crowd cares, like social capital, like civic responsibility, like moral values. I don't want to perhaps to take too much of those, other than that, the strongest perhaps correlate is a proxy of mental health and optimism more generally with IDPs, those who fled from the countryside to the city during the war tend to be less optimistic, have lower levels of inter-community trust, and less score worse in mental health aspects. So if I was to sum up, This is a project about forced displacements, which sadly characterizes conflict nowadays in many parts of the world, in sub-Saharan African countries, in Asia, in the Arab world. We believe that this paper is among the first that provides large evidence on differences in schooling and employment outcomes using the universe or the almost universe of observations, which allows to identify the various displacement trajectories vis-a-vis research, which is very interesting, but looks at particular aspects of displacement or particular historical experiments. Let me say here that I'm part of the blame here. With studies, we have some work looking at refugee flows between Turkey and Greece. We believe this is interesting, but it's specific to this setting. We believe that this setting carries more lessons for external validity. What comes out is that we should not be thinking about necessarily forced displacement versus non-forced displacement, but we should be thinking about the characteristics of where those displaced go to. And the evidence that come from the Mozambican experience clearly suggests that rural to urban migration tends to be associated with a push towards more education and then movement out of agriculture into services. But interestingly, even those who move from the countryside and go to another rural place, again, very rural place, they also tend to invest a bit more on education, supporting the uprootedness hypothesis in an extreme, if I was to say, a case with subsistence agriculture, very rural, very underdeveloped. And what perhaps we should be thinking more in the years to come is think more about forced displacement as a mobility shock, and in an effort to try and design best policies, which we have increasing evidence, not only from the rich countries, but also increasingly so from India. There's a cool paper. We have our joint work with Stelios and Alberto on that, looking more on low income or middle income environments. Thank you very much for staying till so late, and thanks again for this great invitation for this great event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elias. I think it's a very, very cool, interesting, thought-provoking, I would say, project. It's more a comment than a question. But a student of mine, Bruno Contelete, he's on the market this year, by the way. He's doing a structural model of trade and displacement with climate change. And what he finds is that climate change will push a really strong structural change in Africa. And so kind of in his model, you kind of see what you are seeing kind of in the micro data, right? So I find that very fascinating, because for him, it's just like coming out of a structural model, and we were always criticizing him very much for that and saying like, look, you find these positive aspects in climate change, but it seems to be that, you know, this is what it is. So I find that very fascinating. Of course, you know, it's not clear what the policy takeaway is, but I guess that it's a fascinating finding. Sorry, it's more a comment than a question.
Hannes, please tell your student to email me his paper. Let me just use your comment to make a remark here. This does not mean that forced displacement is a good thing. Let's be clear about that. Our survey showed some adverse effects. It just shows that perhaps it can serve, it can increase education. And of course, the policy relation is that we need to think what are the location characteristics, the destination, if you like, characteristics. So and again, we should always be very careful when we do policy recommendation, especially when it's based only on paper. I think this is something that perhaps we need clearly more research in my view.
Elias, can I ask a very quick question?
Please, Andrea.
So first of all, great paper, I mean, very important topic. And my question is about, okay, so the within family evidence is quite convincing, and yet I guess also for migration, even not forced migration, the ones who migrate are typically those who are deemed to be the most successful, right? So there might still be a margin of selection, even within families, the kid who is left to move compared to the one who stays. So I wonder whether, along with the push factors, you might exploit some pull factors as well. I mean, about the surrounding areas, depending on how good these areas are doing, whether the family decides to move it all or just send one out.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. A couple of remarks on this. First, we obtain very similar results, even if we look at individuals who all of them moved. So I'm not comparing now stayers. This family doesn't have any stayer. One ended up in a refugee camp, the other one in another place in the countryside, and another one in the city. So this is the first. Second, and we had like this debate for another paper with Stelios and Alberto. When we talk about selection based on children, the observation I try to keep telling you is that I have Miltos, who is 9 years old, and Nicole, who is 7 years old. And their grandparents and their relatives still debate who is the smarter. So personally, I think that during the war, especially, it's really hard to suggest what on earth kind of selection takes place. Third, one could argue, and actually I see some value on that perhaps if I value more one child, I may decide to send this child to the refugee camp because, quote unquote, this is safer, at least for his or her life. So again, I cannot formally prove that, you know, selection when I compare siblings is nil, but I think it's a bit unlikely. Now we are implementing various strategies in line similar to what you have in mind. The issue here is that even when we look at regions where they lost many people, so there was a lot of out-migration because of conflict, actually there were some also floods in Mozambique at the time, still you have selection because some people stayed, and I will be comparing those who stayed to those who left. So we obtained very similar results, and what we further did, I didn't have much time, is that we construct a buffer area, so those are areas that are equidistant, think about them, between Malawi and Zimbabwe and the inland to the coastal areas. These are like more representative, where it is quote unquote equally likely to say, oh, you go to the city or you go to the neighboring country. And again, we find very similar type of effects. So again, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I just believe that in this application, given the chaos of the war, I think it's a bit unlikely. But point well taken.
Okay, thanks.
Elias, can I ask you a question?
Of course, Juan Felipe.
Yeah, first of all, I really like the results with the siblings. I think that's actually very novel in terms of these studies of migration. I find the evidence quite compelling with like other results. Like there are a couple of papers for Colombia and a recent paper that we have with Felipe Valencia in Laos. We're looking at the structural transformation side of things, and we find like consistent results with this. So it's very nice that it matches. I have like a question regarding, two questions, one regarding spillovers, another regarding manufacturing. So you show agriculture and services, but I didn't see much about manufacturing and also the spillovers. Like you are comparing people who stay with those who move, but is it the difference driven by people who are like the more educated people are the ones who migrate or something like that?
Great question, Juan Felipe. So first, please send me anything related. We are currently working with Sandra, Stelios, and Giorgio on preparing the draft, so it could be very useful. Second, regarding manufacturing, there is a very simple answer. There's no manufacturing. When I say there's no manufacturing, something like 3% of employment at the time. So it's minuscule. So this is the second remark. Third, regarding spillovers. Now, clearly, this is one shortcoming of any analysis like that. So we have not formally modeled spillovers on that. Fourth, regarding the education, we obtained very similar results, the average results, when we look at those who do not have much education to those that have. Let me remind you that the mean education of non-movers, rural born, which is the majority of the population, is something like 11%. That they have acquired 2 or 3 years of education. So it's very, very low. So in this context, think about like almost everyone has extremely low levels of education. So issues like the one that you have in mind, or perhaps they are relevant in Asia, I don't know the Lao experience much. They do not, I mean, here you have a clear big city rural divide. You have just 10, 15 other major towns, and that's it.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the great talk, Elias.
Thank you, Dominic.